Welcome to Real Crime Stories. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the rain as you dive into tonight's chilling tale. If you love true crime and horror, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Now, turn off the lights and let the story begin. Story. I woke up to an emergency alert on my phone. Now there's creatures outside. I woke up to an emergency alert at 6 a.m. this morning on my phone. Checking my phone, the alert read, "Go indoors immediately and remain inside. Await further instructions." After living here for almost 10 years, I've only ever received a handful of emergency alerts, which all presented themselves as tests for the emergency alert system. Generally, I live my life pretty freely and don't take life too seriously. Unfortunately for me, this means I'm not the type of person who prepares for the worst to happen, which I now realize is what I should have been doing. I thought to myself, better safe than sorry, so after getting out of bed, I immediately headed downstairs and checked that both the front and back doors were locked and deadbolted. I live alone and always lock my doors at night, but I needed to verify this simply for sanity's sake, even if I didn't know exactly what was going on. I live in a decently sized 2-story house that I've worked my ass off to make a reality. The windows downstairs all have solid security screens on them, meaning there was no need for me to check the locks on those. After securing the house, I went back upstairs to my bedroom and tried to make a couple of calls. Initially, I called my boss. I couldn't just expect to get the day off work without explaining the situation. If there even was a situation. The phone rang for some time before directing me to her voicemail system. I left a message explaining the emergency alert I received and told her to call me back when she gets the chance so we can discuss what's happened. I tried calling my parents but was again sent straight to their voicemail system. I think at this point was when I was starting to get worried. My parents live almost 2 hours away from me and were always awake at the ass crack of dawn. They never left the house before 8 a.m., but I still tried to convince myself they were busy with something else. So again, I left a message for them to get back to me when they could. My phone dinged. A message from one of my work colleagues. John. He was asking whether I had received the emergency alert too and if I knew anything about why it was sent out. I replied immediately and told him I didn't know any more than he did, but I'd let him know if I found anything out. I needed to calm down now. There was no use worrying over something yet that I didn't even know about. I decided to shower first before having a quick breakfast and turning on the television to get my mind off of whatever could be going on. At this point, it was about 7:30 a.m., the time I would usually be leaving for work. I'm not one to purposely ignore warning signs, so I'd rather get an angry text from my boss than get caught up in whatever caused the emergency alert to be sent in the first place. When I turned the television on, the same emergency alert sound invaded my ears. The volume was so high from the music I was listening to last night I had to dive for the remote to turn it down. The same words that my phone woke me up to were the only words on the screen. Go indoors immediately and remain inside. Await further instructions. Now I was extremely worried. I was realizing this couldn't just be an accident or a test. I'd never seen an emergency warning like this, let alone it being presented on every channel I flicked through. Without any additional information, there was no way for me to know what was going on or how to prepare for it. After turning the volume from the television all the way down, to get a break from that blaring alert sound, I realized how quiet it was outside. No cars commuting, birds chirping, neighbors chatting, or airplanes flying overhead. Nothing. I never realized how accustomed I had become to these background sounds. This lack of background sound made me feel incredibly uneasy, like I could sense something was wrong regardless of the emergency alerts. All of my blinds were still shut, so I hadn't had a chance or even thought about looking outside until this point. There wasn't any specific instructions regarding looking outside anyways, so I didn't really think anything of it. But I thought it would be safest to look outside my bedroom window, which leads out to a small balcony through a sliding glass door. I went into my room and pulled on the string that rotates the vertical blinds. Immediately my room flooded with natural light and the warmth of the sun hit me. I've always loved the warmth of direct sunlight, so I made sure my window was faced towards the sunrise and subsequently towards the street when I had the house built. However, after opening the blinds, what I saw made me immediately drop to the floor. Out of sight from the street, I barely got a glimpse of them, but they looked extremely hostile. These creatures were nothing like any animal I've ever seen and were gathered in a circle in front of the house across from mine. It looked like there were about 8 of them. They were gaunt and tall, and appeared as though they were wearing a suit of skin that was far too tight for their body. Their bones seemed to be almost protruding from their skin. They had no facial features besides a pair of dark sunken eyes that appeared completely white in contrast with their extremely dark skin. These things were far from human but were standing on 2 legs like us. I'm glad they didn't see me. If they can see at all, that is. I don't think I would be writing this right now if they had seen me. After dropping to the floor, I immediately closed the blinds again. I've never had a panic attack before now, but now realizing the actual danger I was in, it sure felt like I was going through something similar. Nothing that was going on was normal. Without confidence, I dialed the emergency telephone number on my phone. Immediately a recorded message sounded through the speaker. Go indoors immediately and remain inside. Await further instructions. This message pierced my ears and continued looping until I ended the call. A couple of hours passed by while I went through my entire phone list trying to get into contact with anyone I possibly could. Now even John wouldn't respond. Not a single person answered their phone or responded to the frantic voicemails I left. At the moment I was safe in my house. But how long would that last? I didn't even know what these creatures were, let alone what they were capable of. I just knew they weren't here to make friends. Eventually, I decided to make my way downstairs and take stock of the food I had. I don't know how long I'll have to wait these creatures out. But the power is still working at the moment, so everything in the fridge and freezer is still okay. The water is still running, obviously, since I was able to take a shower. But again, I don't know how long that will last. I decided to fill up the bathtub in the downstairs bathroom in case the water stops running anytime soon. So I'll have at least 150 liters of drinkable water in that case. Curiosity got the better of me. After taking stock of the food and filling the tub, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already going a little mad. Just yesterday everything had been completely fine. Now I couldn't get in touch with a single person, and there were creatures out on the street I'd never seen before. I needed to look again. I needed to know that what I saw was real and not something I'd made up in my head. This all felt like a weird dream I needed to wake up from. But I knew this was real. I went back upstairs to my bedroom and peeked through the blinds. Surprisingly, the creatures were no longer where I had seen them earlier. I then noticed the door to the house across the street looked to have been scratched through. There were long scratch marks along the length of the wooden door and a large hole in the center. They'd broken their way into that house, but they were no longer anywhere to be seen. That is until I noticed something staring straight back at me through the upstairs window of that same house. The deep sunken eyes I stared into seemed like they'd steal the soul from my body if I looked for too long. After my brain recognized what I was staring at, I leapt backwards away from the blinds. That thing had no doubt seen me. I paced back and forth thinking of what I should do at this point when I heard a horrendous sound coming from downstairs. I quietly made my way down the stairs and towards the sound. The sound pierced my ears. It sounded like something sharp being dragged across metal. That's when I realized they were trying to get inside. The metal security screen door I had installed was being barraged by them. I started moving the bookcases I had by the entrance against the front door. Now, the sun was setting, and they were mercilessly going at it. There was no way I could fend off those things barehanded. That's when I remembered the gift my dad had given me this year for my 25th birthday. I was never really into guns and never really had a need to use one. But at a time like this, it was quite necessary if it had to come to that. I ran back upstairs and into the guest room where I'd stored everything that was gifted to me for my birthday this year. The pistol was still in its case, and I quickly removed it and loaded it with the ammunition my dad had shown me how to use. I have never fired a gun, so this still remains a last resort. Now I'm sitting in my room writing this. The pistol is sitting on my bedside table, and I can still hear those creatures downstairs. I don't know exactly what I should do. Should I run, or should I fight? If you're reading this, please respond. So it's been a couple of days since my last post. A lot has happened. On a positive note, I'm not dead yet. However, I'm in a new predicament now. I need to post this as a record of what has happened here. I'll start from where I left off in my previous post. That hideous sound from the front door downstairs didn't let up. I needed to decide whether I would find somewhere safe to hide within the house or make a run for it while those creatures were preoccupied at the door. Both of these options had downsides. If I decided to stay in the house and hide, I'd find myself trapped should they find me. If I decided to run, there's no way of knowing how well they are at tracking or even how many more of them there are outside. I also have no experience shooting a gun, so I felt as though an enclosed environment would give me the best chance of landing a shot should it come to that. But then again, there's no telling whether a bullet would stop them or not. I do have an attic that I hope would be difficult to reach by those creatures. The opening is in the second bedroom and requires a ladder to get up. Fortunately, I painted that room earlier in the year and borrowed a ladder from my father, which I forgot to return to him. With this plan in my head, I immediately put it in action. I needed to gather food and water before going up there, but I didn't know how much time I had left before they broke through the door and makeshift barricade. The bottom of the stairs are right by the front door, so if I couldn't get back to the stairs in time, I'd be dead for sure. I grabbed the pistol that had been sitting beside me and bolted downstairs. And then I realized these creatures weren't just bombarding the front door. The sound of metal scratching on metal came from the windows too. Never have I ever been so thankful that I had security screens installed on those windows too. But I couldn't imagine they would hold up for much longer. I had no time to screw around. With haste I headed towards the kitchen. A lot of the food was still on the counter from when I was taking stock. I grabbed a couple of shopping bags from the pantry and scooped whatever I could from the counter and filled the bags. Not forgetting to grab the can opener. I grabbed it too from the utensil drawer. I predicted all the food I had would last me about 2 weeks if I stretched it out. But I didn't have time to gather everything, and I wouldn't be making a second trip down here anytime soon. Water was more important anyways. Without water, I wouldn't even last a week. The only thing I could think of was to fill all the water bottles I had and hope they would last me until these creatures moved on. I rummaged through the cupboards and found 4 different water bottles of varying sizes and filled them at the tap as fast as I could before throwing them in the bags with the food. These bags were heavy now. I placed the pistol in my waistband and lifted the bags. Running towards the staircase, a loud crash came from the kitchen window behind me. Not like what I'd already been hearing. It sounded like one of them had gotten through the security screen. I didn't have time to look back and honestly was too scared too. Hoping I'd make it in time, I dashed up the stairs as fast as I could and ran straight for the spare bedroom. I slammed the door behind me and quickly locked it, knowing full well that a thin bedroom door wouldn't stop those things. I dropped the bags and grabbed the ladder that was laying on the ground. Lining it up with the attic opening, I climbed up and moved the panel covering the opening. More loud crashes and heavy footsteps on the wooden floors could be heard from downstairs. There wasn't much time left. I grabbed the bags and lifted them into the attic with all the strength I could muster. This is when I realized I'd left my phone in my bedroom. I felt like I needed it in case anybody tried to contact me. But I clearly wasn't in the right state of mind at the time. Without even thinking, I climbed down the ladder, away from the safest place I could hope to be right now, and swung the door open about to bolt for my bedroom. Stupidly thinking I still had time to spare. The figure I saw at the bottom of the staircase stunned me and I froze for a second. My mind told me to scream, but it was like I was paralyzed, and nothing came out of my mouth. Its eyes stared wide, the same eyes I had stared into from the window across the street. Suddenly, the figure lunged towards me up the stairs, and I snapped out of it. I ran backwards into the spare room and slammed the door closed again. The creature made contact with the door and a loud thump sound resonated in my ears from the impact. I pounced at the ladder and scurried up through the opening. I don't know how smart they are, but my mind told me I needed to pull the ladder up, or they'd definitely know I'm up here. I leaned over the opening and reached for the ladder. Grabbing it firmly, I heaved upwards and backwards. This ladder wasn't light, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins must have helped as I pulled it up into the attic. Vicious scratching sounds came from the bedroom door, and just as I placed the panel over the opening, the sound of the door being caved in boomed. I held my breath and closed my eyes in the dark. I could hear the creature below me, scurrying around and destroying everything in the room. It would have torn me apart if it had caught me. I'm sure of that. Soon I could hear the other creatures making their way up the staircase and into the room too. The fact that they made no vocal sound unsettled me, like a silent serial killer with a mask. But I'm not sure I'd rather be listening to whatever visceral sound they would make if they had mouths. The only thing I could do from here on out was wait. Wait until they settled down or lost interest and keep as quiet as possible. I didn't move an inch for a few hours and continued listening to the rampage happening below me. I had no way of knowing how good their hearing was, and I was in no rush to find out. I silently prayed that my phone would survive the ordeal so I wouldn't be completely isolated if there were a chance of contacting someone, and internally reprimanded myself for being stupid enough to forget it. I had no way of knowing what time it was exactly, but a glimpse of sunlight shone through the small window in the attic, signifying dawn was upon us. I had survived the night, and for that I was thankful. I could still hear faint sounds coming from the house below, but the creature's rampage had subsided for the most part. As quiet as I could, I grabbed a snack bar out of one of the bags and drank from one of the bottles I had filled. Only now realizing how thirsty I was when the lukewarm water that I would usually only drink ice cold met my lips. I gulped down half the bottle before I could stop myself. I didn't want to risk going down anytime soon, so I stayed up in the attic for the entire day. I actually felt relatively safe. I assumed they didn't know I was up here, since I'm sure they would have joined me by now if they did. But I couldn't stay up here forever. I still needed to get my phone for obvious reasons. If it hadn't been destroyed yet, that is. I eventually passed out from exhaustion, I think, since I don't remember purposefully laying my head down to rest. Despite waking up knowing that time had definitely passed and having my bladder screaming at me to release its contents. Though, there obviously isn't a toilet in the attic, so I'll spare you those details. Needless to say, I remained as quiet as possible. Eventually I realized I could no longer hear any sound coming from the house below. But getting down and back up again wouldn't be a walk in the park, since I'd need to use the ladder again, and staying anywhere else in the house clearly wasn't safe, with what I can only guess the state of the windows and doors being in shambles. Luckily though, if the phone had survived, it would only be in the next room over where I'd left it. I decided to wait a few more hours before executing the retrieve and retreat again plan. Slowly I removed the panel from the attic opening and quietly surveyed the spare room below. Everything looked to have been torn to shreds, and I could only imagine what would have happened had I taken just a few moments too long to get up into the attic. Whilst the room was a mess, there was no sign of the creatures in the direct vicinity. I poked my head out further and peeked towards the bedroom door. Well, what was left of it at least. Again, no sign of them. Still, I couldn't hear a thing from downstairs, so I quietly moved the ladder and lowered it down slowly. I made sure to hold the pistol tight while climbing down the ladder as light-footed as I could and made my way to the doorway. The bottom of the stairs looked clear too, but I wasn't going to risk going down there right now. I crept towards the open doorway that was once my bedroom door and surveyed the room silently, trying to locate my phone. My bed had been turned upwards, and clothes from my closet that had been hanging neatly were now strewn across the floor with plenty of ferocious slashes through them. Finally I located my phone. It seemed odd that it was sitting so perfectly on top of my favorite jacket. But I grabbed it and turned towards the doorway. That's when I saw the creature rise onto two legs through my balcony window, like it had been waiting for me in a crouched position. Once again, the creature stared at me for a moment with its deep sunken white eyes, but without thinking. I aimed the pistol at the creature and pulled the trigger. The sound of the glass shattering made a deafening sound, and I fell backwards. I didn't know if I had hit the creature or not, but I needed to get back into the attic now if I had any chance of getting out of this unscathed. The sound of the gun would surely alert the others. I knew this, so I immediately got to my feet and started back towards the attic opening. I glanced at where the creature had been a second ago, but it wasn't there anymore. Assuming I had hit it, I made my way back to the spare room and hurried up the ladder with my phone in my back pocket. The sound of the creatures galloping up the stairs surprised me, and I glanced towards the staircase from the open doorway. They saw me this time. I hurtled up into the attic and kicked the ladder out from under myself. I quickly moved the panel back over the opening and threw the heavy bags on top of it, hoping to weigh it down. Immediately the pounding began. Pulling my phone out of my back pocket, I unlocked the screen. Another emergency alert flashed on the screen. It read, "Seek nearest bomb shelter immediately. Saturation bombing inbound. ETA, 1503 p.m. The clock on my phone showed the time as 12:30 p.m. If you're reading this right now, please respond. Reading the emergency alert on my phone. My heart sunk. I had just 2.5 hours to make it to the nearest bomb shelter. With those creatures relentlessly pounding on the attic access panel and only the small attic window as an escape option, my chances of making a safe escape stood at almost 0%. But I wasn't about to give up. The nearest bomb shelter I knew of was nowhere near where I lived, with no way of knowing how many of those creatures were roaming around outside. I wouldn't stand a chance of making it there on foot. I'd need a car, but my car is in the garage and my keys are, or were, in a bowl where one always leave them by the front door. It would be far too risky to go back into the house if I managed to escape, as I'm sure I would need time to find them considering the state of just my bedroom, and time is something I don't have a lot of. Thinking through the different scenarios in my head, immediately I remembered one of my neighbors, Craig, stopping me on a morning run a while back and telling me about how he preps for the end of the world. Something I definitely thought he was crazy for at the time and forgot about almost completely not long after he told me. I never thought anything like this would ever happen. He told me he had a bunker installed under his house about a year ago with enough food to last a family of 4 for a year. Despite him living alone, his house is a couple down from mine, but I never actually saw anything being installed. At this point though, this was the only chance I had at making it somewhere survivable before the bombs hit. I needed to get to his place ASAP, and I had only one option of getting out of the attic. Immediately I made my way over to the attic window. It was small but slid open in its entirety from the bottom, so I guessed I could manage to squeeze out. Luckily I never had security bars installed on it. I needed to do this without alerting any of those creatures if there were still any outside the house. Whether they could climb, scale the house or not, I prayed for the latter. I popped the window open slightly and peeked out. The window faced towards the neighbor's house and in the same direction I needed to go. The way the house was designed meant I could lower myself onto the roof of the lower level of the house once I got outside and not have to drop all the way to the ground and probably seriously injure myself in the process. From the window, I couldn't immediately see any of the creatures in the vicinity. I forced the window open as far as it could go and propped my leg up and out. Once one of my legs were out, I hunched down and moved the rest of my body through the opening, followed by my other leg. Holding onto the window sill, I faced the wall and lowered myself slowly till my feet met the roof of the lower floor. The roof tiling was solid, but I didn't trust myself enough to not slip and fall off. So I lowered my body onto all fours and crouched down. From here I could definitely be seen from the street whether I was crouching or not. So I immediately moved further towards the back of the house. I guessed it would be a lot more likely that there would be more of those creatures on the street rather than in my backyard. I was right. I scanned the backyard from my vantage point and didn't see any of the creatures. However, I could still hear the creatures pounding on the attic panel, which would likely attract more of those things if they were attracted to sound. This also meant those ones were still preoccupied and I still had time before they figured out I wasn't up there anymore. I carefully made my way towards the gutter pipe, which traversed the length of the house from top to bottom, and made one final scan before lowering myself onto it. Sliding down the pipe, I tried my best to stay quiet. However, the worst thing that could possibly happen at that point occurred. The fixtures that secured the pipe onto the wall came loose. As the screws tore from the wall, the pipe, along with me, came crashing down onto the concrete pavement, slamming into the ground. The air immediately left my lungs. I tried breathing in again, but I couldn't. I knew I had no time to mess around, and those creatures would have likely heard the commotion. I managed my way to my feet and forced myself towards the side of the house, away from the back door. At this point, my breath came back to me, but the pain in my back ached immensely and I collapsed against the house. That fall definitely left a mark, and if this were any other time I would probably have laid down and called for help. But help wasn't coming. I realized the pounding sound from the attic I had been hearing had stopped and my heart sunk once more. They were coming. I picked myself up again and started moving again. I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins and knew a wasted second could be the difference between surviving this ordeal and being torn apart in a few moments. I needed to stay out of sight, so my first instinct was to scale the fence in front of me. The pain in my back throbbed, but my will to live grew stronger. I jumped up and grabbed the top of the fence, holding on tightly. Pulling myself up, I thanked myself for working out regularly, which granted me increased upper body strength. I propped a leg up onto the fence and worked to pull the rest of my body up and over. My way down on the other side, however, was far from graceful. As I pulled my body over the fence, my descent was halted as my shoe got caught on a loose screw protruding from the top of the fence. Tugging on my shoe, it came loose from the nail and I fell into a bush directly below me on the other side of the fence. While my descent wasn't graceful, it also wasn't too loud. However, this was no time to be hopeful, and I immediately brought myself to my feet and moved towards my next door neighbor's house. It was probably safer to move between backyard scaling fences than it was to expose myself on the street where other creatures likely lay waiting. Craig's house was just the next one over, so I wasn't far now. I could hear the creatures scurrying around in my backyard. Behind the fence I had climbed. They weren't smashing through the fence or jumping over it yet, so I thanked my lucky stars. I didn't know the family who lived directly next to me, but the state of the house left little to the imagination about their fate. The house had the same security features as mine from what I could see, but most of the back windows were broken and the screen door looked like it had been completely torn open like mine. But the house stood silent right now. I moved towards the fence on the opposite side of the yard, the one they shared with Craig, and quickly peeked over after scanning down the side of the house for any of the creatures. The coast was still clear, but a wave of despair rushed over me when I saw that Craig's house too had taken a beating. It seemed like no house on my street had been left untouched at this point, and I was just one of the lucky ones who was targeted last. Without knowing the full behavior of these creatures, there could very well be one of them still lurking inside his house. It also dawned on me that it was likely Craig had already entered and sealed the bunker he had built for exactly this type of scenario. Whether or not this was the case, it was still my last hope, and I'd rather die trying than die doing nothing at all. Whilst his house was beaten like the others on the street, Craig's yard was clear. I made my way over the fence like I had the other, but this time being more careful not to get snagged on anything. I stayed low to the fence, not wanting the creatures in my yard or anywhere else to catch a glimpse of me, and landed safely on the other side with a quiet thud on the bare dirt. The house was about the same size as mine, but I'd never actually been inside, so the location of Craig's bunker was still to be determined. The upside of his house already being invaded meant that I wouldn't have to do any breaking and entering myself. Just entering, the back door had been torn completely off its hinges and lay on the ground outside the entrance. I moved towards the house and listened carefully for any sounds inside. The only sound I could hear was a banging from the direction of my house. That's when I realized it sounded like the creatures were pounding on the fence I had first scaled. I don't know what caused them to come in this direction, maybe just dumb luck, but I knew it wouldn't be long before they made their way towards me. I removed the handgun from my belt and raised it in front of me before moving swiftly into the open doorway with light footsteps, avoiding making unnecessary sounds that would likely be heard from anyone or anything that remained here. My plan was to look for a basement. I guessed this was the most likely place a hidden bunker would be situated inside a house. The back door entryway led directly into a laundry area, where shattered glass was strewn across the floor. Directly connected to this was the kitchen, which I scoped out carefully before entering. The glass on the floor made me very cautious of where I placed my foot. The large pieces of glass would likely not be quiet if shattered further. A loud sound bellowed from outside, making my heart skip a beat. It sounded as if the fence had been bowled over and hit the ground. I had no time to waste if they were getting closer already. I quickly moved through the kitchen and made my way into an open living room. The furniture had been completely torn apart, and the floor was littered with bits and pieces of wood, glass, and other miscellaneous materials. A number of doors led out of this room, any of which could be hiding a way down. However, a door in the corner had clearly been torn through, leaving a large creature-sized gap in its wake. I made the assumption that this was likely where Craig had fled to, which hopefully meant this was the way down to a basement of some sort. More cautiously than ever, I walked towards the battered door. As I entered the room, the lack of light caused my eyes to readjust. A staircase leading down was the first sign that I had been right. I stood silently for a while my eyes slowly adjusted themselves to the darkness. There was no use going down into a basement that I couldn't see a thing in. When I could make out the bottom of the staircase, I carefully moved down the staircase. When I was halfway down the staircase, I saw it. Human remains covered the floor. Blood splatters covered the walls and the ceiling. A large pool of blood was situated in the corner of the room where Craig's mangled body lay. Huge pieces of flesh had been torn out. My stomach turned as I doubled over, dropping my gun and forcefully expelling the small amount of food I had consumed earlier. The sight was horrific. I could not believe that I had actually seen something so graphic. The world around me went mute for a moment as I processed the situation. But a deafening bang came from above me and snapped me out of the daze. The sight of Craig's body had narrowed my vision, but what appeared to be a solid metal door that was slightly ajar came into view near where his body remained. He was just a little too late. I sprinted towards the door and slammed my body into it, opening it wide enough to fit through. Something clattered down the stairs behind me. I glanced back and once again saw a gross creature and its large eyes staring deep into my soul. It was coming towards me faster than I had imagined, and my gun remained at the bottom of the staircase where I had so foolishly dropped it. Without thinking, I heaved the door closed with all the strength I could muster and spun the handle. The sound of the creature slamming into the door could be heard as the metal bolts locked the door in place. It's been a while. I heard the bombs drop about an hour after my last post. The bunker shook so hard I thought it was going to collapse on me. But after the last explosion, the walls and the ceiling remained solid. Without Craig and his prepper tendencies, I wouldn't be alive right now. I didn't know him too well, but I can't let his death be in vain. When I first got in here, the creatures continued pounding on the door relentlessly, but to my relief none of them had managed to make their way into the bunker before I did. After the final bomb dropped, the outside world went silent. From inside the bunker, it seemed like the creatures hadn't even made a dent in the thick metal door that separated me from them. After hours of listening for any activity outside the door, I collapsed onto the bed. Craig had installed a single cot which wasn't particularly comfortable, but with the sense of a seemingly safe environment to lay down in and the fact that it was a hell of a lot more comfortable than the wooden floor in the attic. I managed to fall asleep. I had vivid nightmares of the creatures that night and woke up in a cold sweat. I opened my eyes and was looking directly up at the ceiling. I tried to lift my head, but something stopped me. My body was stiff and rejected every signal I gave it to move. It felt heavy, like gravity had increased tenfold and I was stuck. That's when I noticed in the corner of my eye the dark figure that stood in the opposite corner of the room. Its shadow cast by the small battery-operated light on the wall next to me. I struggled to make out who or what it was that had found its way into this safe place I thought I had secured. The figure started moving towards me and my heart skipped a beat. The figure's face became illuminated by the light, and its huge sunken eyes stared back into mine. I wanted to scream. I wanted to jump out of the bed I was helplessly lying in and do something about the situation I had found myself in. But the closer the creature got to me, the less control I felt I had over my own body. Its tall form reached higher than most professional basketball players, with its head nearly touching the bunker's relatively low ceiling. At this range I could make out more details about the creature. Tightly bound to its thin body, the creature's dark skin appeared charred. Its huge eyes remained the only recognizable characteristic on its face, and its long, sharp, finger-like claws taunted me. The creature arched its head down towards me and its face grew closer to mine. It felt as though the creature was sucking the soul from my body. The sheer terror I felt and the malicious force this creature exuded forced me to squeeze my eyes closed and wait for the inevitable to occur. But nothing happened. Moments passed and I waited, still nothing. I opened my eyes again and the creature was gone. I tried to get off the bed and my body finally responded. The weight that held me down had suddenly lifted. Completely shaken, I examined the place the creature had been before I closed my eyes and found no trace. The creature had vanished, or maybe it was never there in the first place. But it felt so real. I'd never experienced sleep paralysis before, but those creatures had an unimaginable effect on my psyche, it seemed. I couldn't continue sleeping after that ordeal. I got up completely and made the bed. I decided to take an inventory of what Craig had bought for this place. He wasn't lying about the amount of food that he had stockpiled. While it wasn't anything fancy or particularly tasty, It got the job done, and beggars can't be choosers. A huge water tank had been installed in the bunker, which was completely full of potable water. The lights in the bunker were powered by rechargeable batteries. And Craig had obviously never wanted this place to go dark because there were enough in here to last a lifetime. I estimated that if I rationed correctly, I could live for at least a year in the bunker with these supplies. I didn't really have a clue on what to expect about the size and contents of the bunker before getting there. All that mattered before was getting to the bunker in one piece. Literally, the size of the bunker was adequate for a single person. About 4 by 4 meters. Consisting of a single living space with everything needed for long-term survival located in the one room. From the bunker door located in the center of the south wall. The bed I slept on prior was situated in the adjacent right corner of the room. The toilet was located in the opposite corner adjacent to the north and east walls. Along with all the miscellaneous medical supplies. In the far left corner, adjacent to the north and west walls, was the large water tank, and next to that, was where Craig had stored the food supplies in countless numbers of large sturdy containers that towered over me. Additionally, the clothes located in the other corner, adjacent to the south and west wall, were my size, so it meant I wouldn't need to sit and bathe in my own filth while seeking refuge here. Fortunately, Craig was obviously a meticulous prepper, as almost every container and compartment was labeled with exactly what it contained. After moving a few of the containers that lined the walls, to my surprise, I stumbled upon one labeled weaponry. I didn't know what to expect inside, but I prayed there would be something that could replace the pistol I so stupidly dropped at the bottom of the basement stairs before coming in here. Carefully lifting the lid, the contents of the container revealed itself to me. Inside laid a pistol. It appeared to be a similar model to the one I had lost. But guns were and definitely still aren't my forte. A box full of ammunition was positioned next to the gun, in addition to a decently sized sheathed hunting knife. I picked up the knife and removed it from its sheath. The sharp blade looked brand new and was about 6 inches long. Not that it would be much use against the creatures anyways. I would be torn to a part before I could even get close enough to land a hit with it. But regardless, it was better than no melee weapon at all. I definitely thought I had the mental ability to stay isolated for a long period of time. But after a single day, I felt like those creatures were getting into my head. Humans are social creatures, and I'm afraid I'll go crazy in here alone. Especially considering what I saw when I woke up. I would physically be safe here, but staying here alone for a long period of time seemed just as bad as facing the new reality that was outside. If I can't even go a single night without seeing those creatures, the bunker would be the end of me and my mental health if I wasn't careful. It was hard to tell what was going on outside the safety of the bunker. Not only could I not hear anything, I also had no signal on my phone since entering, and Craig obviously didn't plan on contacting the outside world when shit hit the fan, because I wasn't able to find any form of radio that would work in a place like this. However, it was important for me to find out the fate of everyone else. I couldn't be the only survivor. It was almost as if something was compelling me to leave the bunker. The dreams and the visions I'd had led me to believe that something didn't want me to stay in the shelter and safety of the secure bunker. I convinced myself that I could always return here if necessary, but getting to a bunker where there are other people and a community to develop would be an ideal situation. I decided to wait over a week before making this decision. The days in the bunker dragged on, and without a sense of day and night, I constantly felt like I was on the edge of going crazy. An irrational fear grew inside me. The nightmares and visions of the creatures became worse, but always ended before they offed me for real. Something wasn't right here, and I was itching to get out. If the creatures were waiting for me outside the bunker door, I would be torn apart in moments. But I had to believe that the bombs that were deployed wiped a large portion of them out. However many there were to begin with. Regardless, I needed to know, and I had a firearm once again to back me up. I found a high-quality bug-out bag already pre-packed with essential equipment during my stay here, which included a portable water filter and canteen, fire starters, medical gear, a change of clothes, a few MREs, a torch, navigation tools, a multi-tool, and a tarp. Needless to say, this made the choice of what to bring with me a lot easier. Additionally, despite the hunting knife I found earlier being a seemingly useless weapon against these creatures, It provided some peace of mind for whatever reason, and I decided to carry it along too, as well as the pistol and ammunition found with it. I was as prepared as I would ever be. And whether I stayed in the bunker or not, my fate would likely remain the same if those creatures still remained outside. If they survived those bombs, how the hell am I supposed to do the job? The plan was to get out of the bunker safely, find a form of transport, get to the nearest communal bomb shelter where I would likely find any remaining survivors. And when it's safe, I would come back and take all the supplies from the bunker. With the backpack on my back, a stomach full of as much food and water I could fit, and the pistol in front of me, ready to fire at anything that moved when I opened the door. I turned the handle and heard the bolts release. My nerves began to kick in. But what waited ahead of me, I needed to discover. Pulling the door, it cracked open and a cold draft hit me. Opening it further, I inspected the room, which was dark but seemingly empty. I guessed it was still dawn outside, and I looked at my phone to check the time. It buzzed in my hand and the vibration startled me. It was another emergency alert. The emergency alert that had appeared on my phone's screen read, "The creatures have been eradicated. Any remaining survivors should seek aid at the nearest communal bomb shelter." My mind eased as I read the words. It seemed as though the bombs had actually worked, and from where I stood, the coast was clear. I looked back at the bunker and my mind went back to the things I had seen during my stay in there. There was no way I could live the rest of my life in there. The only thing left for me to do would be to obey the message. The nearest communal bomb shelter was located relatively far from my current location, and the trek on foot would be far from ideal. I needed to find a working vehicle that had not been affected by the bombs or some other means of transport. However, if the alert was true, walking would definitely be a possibility. I stepped out of the bunker and the cool morning air hit me again. I guessed that Craig's house above me no longer stood in its entirety, otherwise I would not have been feeling a gust of wind in his basement. The gun I had dropped before entering the bunker, that had landed on the ground at the bottom of the staircase, was no longer anywhere to be seen. The weirdest part about this situation, though, is that Craig's body was missing too. The pool of blood where he had been laying remained, but what was left of him had been moved elsewhere or simply vanished. It was exceptionally weird that the gun and Craig's body would be missing, but these creatures had used a bait trick on me once before, so I decided it would be better to forget about that gun and solely rely on the one I had obtained in the bunker if I happened to still need it. Regardless, I didn't want to stay by the door of the bunker for much longer, and I couldn't only rely on the correctness of what the emergency alert had told me. There was no telling whether the creatures had silently returned or remained here for some time since the bombs had dropped, if they were actually still alive and lurking. I moved towards the staircase, which seemed to be unharmed by the bombs. The entire basement seemed completely intact, for that matter. At the top of the stairs, the door that had once been there was no longer, and the morning light shone through. I slowly began climbing the staircase, waiting for the moment where a lurking creature would pounce on me and end my life. But as I reached the top and peeked out of the doorway, not a single sound could be heard. The house around me was in shambles. The ceiling and walls had been severely damaged, leaving only a skeleton of what this place once was behind. But without a creature in sight, now was a better time to move than ever. I slowly moved towards what was once a perfectly intact window, but now just a frame which faced the street. Through the window I could see that it was not only Craig's house that had been severely damaged, but every other house within my line of sight, and all of the surrounding foliage was in a similar state. Anything that could survive the impact of the bombs that were dropped would have to be superhuman. There was no way any normal living being could come out of something like that unscathed. At this point, I realized that the likelihood of me finding a functioning vehicle near my location would be next to none, and without the keys to a random person's car that was safely tucked away in their garage, it would be useless. To get there by foot, it would take at least an hour, maybe even two, depending on the speed I would be traveling. I needed to have faith that there really were no creatures remaining on the surface, or I wouldn't last very long in the outside world. My only other option was returning to the bunker, which would cause me to spiral further into losing my mind. And there was no way I was doing that if there was hope that other survivors waited for me. Human company is what I so desperately needed. Without much of a second thought, I decided to cautiously leave the remains of what was once Craig's house and head in the direction of the communal bomb shelter, where I pleaded only survivors would meet me. Human survivors, that is. The sound of birds chirping and the other background noise that we get so accustomed to was eerily absent, and the charred buildings and foliage gave the neighborhood a mute tone. I thought about humming to myself while walking to my destination, but the thought of a lone remaining creature hearing me from somewhere it had been hiding during the bombs forced me to keep my mouth closed and travel with a light step. Moving towards the shelter, I kept a firm grip on my gun and remained on high alert. Continuously scanning my surroundings, I prayed to not to see a creature peer from a broken window or from around the next corner, and that I would never have the misfortune of looking one of those creatures in the eyes again. The eyes of those creatures had already been scarred into the back of my mind. I thought back to the first time I had locked eyes with one of them through my neighbor's window. Even the image in my head caused me to feel extremely paranoid. Almost as though I was being watched from afar or stalked, but there was no obvious signs that this was actually the case. About 3/4 of the way to the shelter, I began letting my guard down. I had almost completely convinced myself that there truly were no creatures remaining here, because I surely would have run into one by this point if the alert had been deceptive or inaccurate. I felt safe for the most part and holstered the gun I had been holding in my waistband to rest my arm. I glanced behind me as a simple precaution, and what met my gaze sent a shiver down my spine. A dark figure swiftly moved behind a fence a few hundred meters down the street from the direction I had come. My heart skipped a beat. There was no doubt in my mind that the figure I had just seen was one of the creatures. I froze for a moment and kept my eyes on where I had seen the creature disappear. A few moments passed, and I tried to convince myself that my mind had simply been playing tricks on me. Had I actually seen that figure, or was it just something my mind had created out of paranoia? Moments later, however, the creature's face peeked from the fence it had disappeared behind, and its eyes locked with mine like I had hoped would never happen again. My mind suddenly flooded with images of the creatures, and the image of Craig's mangled body appeared in front of me. Screaming in horror, I broke my gaze from the creature's huge, deep, sunken white eyes and swiftly turned around towards the shelter. There was no longer any doubt in my mind that I was being followed. And without looking back, I began sprinting towards the shelter faster than I had ever ran before. I couldn't hear anything behind me, but I had no desire to look back and experience what those creatures had just done to me once again, or even slow down for a second. Continuously, I braced myself for a swift slash from behind that would end my life, but was yet to come. My gun was once again grasped tightly in my hand, not wanting to drop my weapon for a second time. Sprinting had closed the gap between me and the shelter. I turned onto the street on which it was located, and now only a few hundred meters of open street stood between me and my new safe haven. The large yellow sign that declared the purpose of the building I was heading towards came into view. But I then realized that the doors to the shelter were closed, and there was not a single person waiting for me outside. I had no other option but to pray that there was someone on the other side willing to open that door for me. A gut feeling took over, convincing me that the creatures were right behind me, ready to mangle my body like what was done to Craig, and compelling me to turn around and look. I turned around while still moving towards the shelter door, and to my bewilderment the coast was clear. I stopped dead in my tracks for a moment, truly debating whether or not I had already gone mad. There was no way what I had seen wasn't real. I couldn't believe that. I turned again back towards the shelter and noticed the door was open, and that a man that was stood just outside of the shelter was waving me over. The man yelled at the top of his lungs for me to run. Swiftly, I checked behind me again, and what I saw made me feel as though I was going to have a heart attack right then and there. A huge horde of those creatures charged in my direction, quickly closing the gap between me and them. Purposefully, I avoided looking at their faces, and without a second thought, turned on my heel and raced towards the door. The man swiftly moved back into the shelter, and, for a second, I thought he would close the door before I made it inside. But to my relief, he kept it open. A moment after I stepped inside the shelter, the man slammed the door shut behind me, but a huge thud on the other side caused it to open again slightly. A barrage of loud thuds came from the other side of the door, and I slammed my body up against it, trying to close it again far enough to lock it in place. Just then, a huge effort from the creatures was made, and the door swung completely open, sending me tumbling down a staircase. Adrenaline rushed through my body, and the pain from falling down the stairs was masked by the fear that those creatures had just breached the door to this shelter. I looked up the staircase I had just descended, and to my dismay saw the creatures violently tearing apart the man's body who had helped me moments ago. All of the hope I once had was lost at this point. But I struggled to my feet and jolted towards a door that appeared to separate the exit from the main living area. Tumbling through the door, I was shocked to see dozens of other people crowded on the other side of the room. Some of these people were trembling on the ground and others were yelling complete gibberish. I quickly turned back around and slammed the door closed. This door was not one that could take much of a beating. But I believed that any time I bought could help me. Without thinking, I started dragging any furniture that wasn't bolted down in front of the door, trying to form a sort of barricade to slow the creatures down. A young girl's voice screamed from somewhere behind me asking where her dad was. I could only assume that her dad was the man who I had just seen die right in front of my eyes. I started yelling for the people to help me and that the creatures were going to get in here if we didn't move fast, but not a single person moved from where they were. Another loud voice bellowed from behind me, from a woman this time, blaming me for dooming them all and damning me to hell. A sudden rush of realization hit me. I understood exactly why this had happened. Those things wanted me to come out of Craig's bunker. They wanted me to lead them to the other survivors, and that's why they had been stalking me on my way here. They were not allowing me any other option but to get to where I now was. But the emergency alert I had received, was that another one of those creatures' mind tricks too? Like what I thought I had seen whilst seeking refuge in the bunker, was that really sleep paralysis or something more sinister? It was clear that the answers to these questions would remain unanswered. After piling what I could in front of the door, I moved backwards towards the other side of the room. The people behind me continued yelling at me while I looked around for any other way out of this situation. Swiftly, I spotted a door to my left that had been left slightly ajar and ran towards it, hoping for something that was never going to happen. As I swung the door open, I realized that it was only a small storage area. A loud bang came from behind me and I turned around. The furniture that I had stacked in front of the door had been sent flying across the room, and without thinking I moved quickly into the storage area I had come upon. Screams from the other side of the door bellowed throughout the enclosed area and were soon replaced by the sounds of flesh being torn apart. The storage area I'm in has no alternate exits. No way out. It won't be long until those creatures find me in here. And there's no way I have enough bullets to even cause a dent in the numbers they have. This will almost definitely be my last update. The only solace I have now is the fact that I'll be saving a bullet for myself. For anyone else who receives the emergency alert that I did, I'll pray for you. Good luck and goodbye. Welcome to Real Crime Stories. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the rain as you dive into tonight's chilling tale. If you love true crime and horror, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Now, turn off the lights and let the story begin. I own a journal written by a serial killer. When I checked it this morning, I found a new entry. My first true crime novel was published in early 2011. The book followed the 4-year career of a serial killer in southern Illinois, covering the grisly details of his murders and eventually ending with his arrest. The book was absolutely perfect. I poured hundreds of hours into research, interviews, and writing. I was convinced that it was a sure ticket into a life as a famous author. My publisher had other plans. They claimed that money was far too tight and that they had to cancel my marketing campaign. It was just a coincidence that they abandoned me just as they pushed hundreds of thousands of dollars resources towards another author. So of course, my novel failed. Of course, no one bought it. And if there's one thing publishers avoid more than unpublished amateurs, it's authors with a single failed book. I've spent the last few years trying to cobble something together that might convince them to give me another chance. When I heard about a string of murders in my town, it seemed the perfect opportunity for a comeback. I poured myself another glass of whiskey by the light of my computer monitor. My ice cube had melted 3 glasses back. But no matter. I couldn't slow my research into the killer's background, his victims, his method of murder, all of it. I took a sip as I reread another police report. The killer had used a fire axe to commit the crimes. Very gory. That was good. Gory murders always sell better than boring firearm-related crimes. Even better was the fact that he'd killed families instead of single people. That was yet another angle I could exploit. I clicked on a news clip from the night he'd been arrested. The best part of this case was the fact that the lunatic had turned himself in. I drained the rest of my glass, already planning what I'd write about that. Family serial killer with a conscience? I made a list of names to contact the next day. The police raid on the killer's apartment had been highly publicized, so knew exactly where he lived. I looked up the landlord who owned the apartment complex and wrote his number down on a little notebook I carry around with me. A few well-placed lies might get me a tour of the killer's private quarters. I woke up the next morning with a splitting headache and nausea. But I didn't let that slow me down. I rolled over, took a shower, and went out to meet with the landlord of the apartment. He was a tall, portly man in his late 40s. He seemed friendly, and more than a little stupid. He unlocked the door for me and showed me a few of the rooms. The apartment had been almost completely cleared out by someone. I guessed first the police and then movers. I nodded along as the landlord continued the tour of the apartment, showing me the kitchen, then the master bedroom. I knew the killer had a habit of hiding bodies inside crawl spaces from my research, and was on the lookout for them. I noticed a vent in the corner of the master bedroom that looked to be pressure fit into the wall. Seems like a great place. Just the kind of thing I've been looking for, I said, wiping away the post-drinking sweats that were growing on my forehead. You mind if I use the bathroom before we finish here? The landlord pointed to the master bathroom. Be my guest. I purposefully spent a long time in there, hoping he'd leave the bedroom. I was rewarded when he called out, I'll be by my car downstairs when you're finished. I left the bathroom and crept up to the vent. I pulled hard on the metal, and was rewarded as it slid smoothly from the wall. Inside was a space about 2 feet wide and 1 foot tall. It extended back into the darkness for several feet at least. And there, lying in the dust on the metal floor, was a leather-bound notebook. I snatched it from the ground, hardly believing my luck. It was thick and well used, but I stuffed it inside my shirt for the time being. Replacing the metal grate was harder than pulling it off, but I managed it without making too much noise. I returned to the landlord outside, turning to look up at the small apartment. I'm going to be honest with you, I said. How's that? He asked, confused. I'm Jim Sullivan, a true crime novelist, I said. I'm here to find out if there's anything interesting left about your most recently departed tenant. The landlord's face clouded over with anger. So this was a waste of my time then? I was wondering if you had any information about. Not for liars. Get off my property. I never want to see you here again. I thanked him and returned to my car, my mind already on nothing but the thick leather booklet inside my shirt. I rushed home, guarding the notebook like a goose with a golden egg. I prepared my desk with a spiral notebook and a blue pen ready by my right hand. Then, trembling, I opened the notebook. It was far better and far worse than I could have ever imagined. The killer had written his planning of the murders in excruciating detail. He explained how he watched the houses, how he waited to see whether or not the husbands loved their wives, Whether or not the children were disobedient, what kind of dinners they ate and at what time. He must have stalked them for days beforehand. But the details in the planning were nothing to the details in describing the murders themselves. I had to pause halfway through reading one account. He kept describing the look on the father's face as his wife died. I poured myself a tall drink, drained it, then poured myself another. The killer languished in the description of their cries, their last dying moments, their pitiful supplication for mercy. I finished the bottle before I finished the notebook. After his account of the fourth family murder, the pages of the book finally, mercifully, went blank when he finished describing the desecration of the last corpse. I closed the book with trembling fingers. My head throbbed with alcohol and the horrible images racing through my mind. But I couldn't help but hold my hands to my mouth in joy. What a find! What a treasure trove of information! 100 years of interviews couldn't give me what this one book had just dropped into my lap. I was going to be famous again. I laughed out loud to the empty room, picked up the already empty bottle of whiskey to my lips, and licked at the last drops before walking to my bedroom. I woke up late the next afternoon feeling woozy. I felt something worse than a hangover. Must have drunk more than I'd been planning to. But could anyone really blame me? Reading those horrible things I'd read? No, of course. No one could blame me. In fact, no one could blame me if I had another drink right now to ease this horrible throbbing in my skull. I got to my feet and walked to the kitchen. I cracked open a beer before walking back to my desk. The notebook caught my eyes as I passed. It was different somehow, thicker. I picked it up and realized that my blue pen had been lodged inside of the leather-bound notebook. I opened it up and saw a brand new entry that hadn't been there the night before. I sat down at the desk, trying to make sense of this new entry, written in a different handwriting from the others. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was reading. I read, in similar, meticulous detail, how I had gone to a house up in the mountains and killed a young couple on their honeymoon. I read about how I'd killed the husband, and that I'd taken the wife's body back with me. I immediately jumped to my feet and ran to my computer, Googling the address furiously. Had I written this in some kind of murder and alcohol-induced sleepwalking? The address was real. It was a house just a half hour away, and there were no news articles about any murders in the area. My breathing continued to quicken as I stared at the house. The descriptions from the notebook matched it perfectly. It wasn't necessarily my handwriting, but there's no doubt it was different from the other entries, and it had been written with my pen. I Googled the nearest payphone, marked the location, and drove there. I dialed 911 with a gloved hand. 911, what's your emergency? A voice on the other end asked. Can you send someone over to a house for me? I'm concerned that something bad may have happened. Sir, what do you? I cut her off, instead passing the address. Did you get that? I asked. She said. I read the address again, then hung up. I drove back to my house, thinking hard the entire way. God, I needed a drink. My garage door opened up and I drove inside. It was only then that I noticed the axe on the ground. I closed the garage door and rounded my car. An unfamiliar axe lay on the ground beside the door to my house. I knelt down and picked it up to inspect it. The metal head was crusted with a layer of blood and hair. I stumbled back, holding my hand to my mouth. when no monster leapt from the darkness. I dropped the axe to the floor and walked inside to open another bottle. I spent the next hour constantly refreshing the news and praying for what must have been the first time in years. Please, I begged, please let this be some big misunderstanding. Please. It only took 3 hours before the double homicide was front-page news. I was already in an alcohol-fueled haze at that point. Every single detail was correct. Husband dead, wife missing. I realized then that I hadn't looked around my house. The wife's body was somewhere. After all, wouldn't she be in the house of her killer? The notebook had been silent on her final location. I spent the next hour looking through my house for places where I may have stashed her body, but came up short. A strange, bizarre revulsion to the notebook came over me. It had caused this. I wasn't sure how, but I knew that if I'd never picked it up, I wouldn't have that axe in my garage nor a conscience so weighted down by no. That wasn't possible. I had to get rid of it. I briefly considered burning the notebook, but rejected the idea. No, something told me that the book belonged back in the apartment where I found it. I drank a shot of espresso to sober up, then started walking. The apartment was just a few blocks away, and I figured I'd already killed enough people for one day. The night was cold, but I barely felt the chill through the haze of guilt, confusion, and fear. I reached the killer's apartment 20 minutes later. One of the windows on the ground floor was unlocked, which allowed me to slide inside. I closed it behind me and looked around at the apartment. The other killer had turned himself in, hadn't he? He'd had a conscience. My mouth turned down into a snarl. It wasn't my fault, even if I did do it. It was this damned notebook. I pulled it out and threw it onto the ground. After a moment of hesitation, I scooped it back up and walked up the dark stairs to the master bedroom. It was the same as I'd left it the day before, though the vent looked off. Maybe the landlord had noticed I'd messed with it. No matter. I knelt down and pulled hard on the vent, earning a cut on my thumb as the metal slid free. I reached down and grabbed the notebook, then extended my arm into the darkness where I hit something soft and wet. I flipped on my phone's light and saw the body of a woman lying inside, covered in enough blood to leave the scent of iron in the air. I stumbled back, trying to make sense of it. Surely I hadn't killed this woman, then driven to this house, right? Then my thought from earlier returned to me. The woman's body was almost certainly on the killer's property. The front door of the apartment below me opened with a crash. I spun and backed up, still on my hands and knees, as the sound of slow, steady footsteps climbed up the stairs. The bedroom door opened, and the light flicked on. The landlord I'd met the other day stood in the doorway holding an axe covered in still wet blood. "Well, I'm sad to say you weren't at home this time," he said, gripping the head of the axe with a beefy fist. "You're probably wondering what the hell's going on. Am I right?" He pointed the handle of the axe towards me. Am I right? I nodded slowly, my mind racing. He hefted the axe in his hands. There's just something about convincing other people that they're killers. Not even the light leaving someone's eyes gives me the rush I felt when that poor sap turned himself in. Sorry, liar. You just happened to be the next to pick up the book. But you made it easy. You even gave me your name. Looks like I'll have to leave that notebook out for someone else to find. Maybe a detective will wake up to find he's killed his wife. What do you think? He took a step into the room. I jumped to my feet and ran for the bathroom. I knew from my time there earlier that it had a window. I'd only made it a few feet before the axe slammed into the back of my left arm. I ignored the pain and leapt at the window, crossed my arms into an X and crashed through the glass. The fall was just long enough for me to reflect on my poor decisions before I hit the ground. A dozen things inside me broke with the impact. But that wasn't what worried me. What worried me was that I'd hear heavy footsteps again. But I didn't hear footsteps. I heard a cry of surprise. A young couple ran over to me. "Are you okay?" the man shouted. The last thing I heard before losing consciousness was the wife calling the police. I'll skip over my stay in the hospital, the police's fruitless search for the landlord, and my panic attacks. They still haven't found him, and I don't think I'll be able to sleep until they do. I let the police take copies of the notebook, but I still own the original. The forgotten murder at West Covina High. Many people have forgotten, or simply have never even heard about what happened at West Covina High School back in 2012, which is rather sad. Considering the victim always said that he wanted to be remembered forever. After he died, his name was Jeff Varisco. He was a star baseball and football player at the school, which by default made him automatically very popular. He was tall, dark-skinned, wavy black hair, beautiful amber eyes, a Hollywood smile, and had a body as if he was carved of stone. Every girl wanted him, including me for a while. He never seemed to like me more than a friend, though. Even though I was the head cheerleader and had no problem getting dates with other guys. Surprisingly, he wasn't even vain, which made him even more likable. He was always nice to everyone, even the really nerdy and loner type students. He also came from a rich family, and they always donated a lot of money to charity and cancer centers. His dad was a university professor and his mom was an executive for some company. Jeff was literally the coolest boy next door. One thing that many people did find a little strange, however, is that he seemed to be obsessed with being remembered and missed by everyone he knew and loved. When he died, he always brought it up to pretty much everyone he spoke to a few times a day. Nobody really thought much of it though. But you can only imagine the shock and horror when word got out that Jeff was found with the back of his head bashed in, stomach cut wide open, hanging by his neck with his own instances like a noose from the goalpost at the school football field. Everyone was in complete shock and hysteria after it happened. Foul play was immediately suspected, and police interviewed everyone that knew him, from his parents all the way down to the school custodian, who was the prime suspect for a good while. But the police were at a complete loss. They concluded that the killer wore gloves, as there were no fingerprints detected anywhere at the scene. Nothing ever came from the investigation. The only real evidence they found was a bloody ladder in the school garden shed where the custodian kept some tools, which is why he was a prime suspect. His parents always had accusations and pointed fingers thrown in their faces. By many people in the neighborhood, they eventually moved away, unable to bear it anymore. So many rumors spread around that his parents killed their only son for the thrill of it, that they knew they could get away with it because they were rich and perfect, and tried to put the blame on a school employee. All those rumors, of course, were ludicrous beliefs. The Variscos loved Jeff. I loved Jeff. That's why I did my best to make sure he would always be remembered like he wanted to be. I had to show him that I loved him even though he didn't love me the same way. That's why I called him at 1 a.m. on a rather cold morning, awakening him from his sleep. I had my gloves on. That I received from my dad from the previous Christmas, and asked him to meet me by an empty park to help me with my broken down car. He was always willing to help anyone who asked. He thrived on it. That's why I hit him in the back of the head with a crowbar while he was examining my engine. That's why I used all my strength to lift his unconscious body into my trunk. That's why I drove as fast as I could, passing through a few stop signs and red lights along the way, thankfully, without being pulled over by cops. To get to our school football field where he once played. Before he regained consciousness, I had to drag his deadweight body from the parking lot all the way to the goalpost. I had to take numerous breaks to catch my breath during this part. That's why I promised him that he would be remembered as I pulled out my knife and gutted him as fast as possible. It would have been easier if that didn't cause him wake up. I thought for sure his scream would have alerted someone to come investigate what was happening, or worse, call the police. That would have ruined my way of showing Jeff how much I loved him. Thankfully it didn't, as his scream quickly became lighter until he fell silent and was only able to look up at me, barely managing to breathe due to the massive blood loss. He stared up at me with a look of hurt and betrayal in his eyes. I was pretty confused by this, and I knew I had the obligation to explain to him why I did this. You will always be remembered, Jeff, just like you always wanted. His eyes suddenly had a spark to them for a moment after he heard those words. He then managed to open his mouth to speak to me. Thanks, he responded in a weak whisper, before succumbing to his death. My eyes filled with tears of sadness and joy at the same time. I was sad that the love of my life was gone forever, but joyful that it was me who was the one who fulfilled his wish. I had to finish the job. I had to make sure people always remembered Jeff Varisco. I quickly made my way to the custodian shed by the school garden and picked the lock to retrieve a ladder. I rushed back to Jeff's body with the ladder gripped under my right armpit. Once I got back to Jeff's dead body, I set up the ladder to be able to reach the goal post. I once again had to pull his body up the ladder to the post, which was very challenging. It took me 4 tries to successfully do it. Once I finally managed to get his body to the top of the ladder, I pulled his intestines from his stomach, wrapped some of it around his neck, and then used the rest to tie around the goalpost. It was pretty hard keeping his limp body from falling over. I then climbed down the ladder and pulled it away from Jeff's feet so his body would dangle there from the post. My work was done. No one would ever forget him. But people have indeed forgotten. They all moved on with their lives. No one has spoken about the mysterious murder in years. I failed Jeff. He would be so disappointed in me. I needed to find a way to get people to remember the amazing Jeff Varisco, which is why I am posting my confession here. Please remember him. Please tell people about Jeff Varisco, the attractive high school kid whose promising future was cut short and was met with a grisly end. He never wanted to be forgotten. I searched my parents' names on the dark web. The videos I found were horrifying. When my friend first introduced me to the dark web, I was amazed at how such an unknown thing could house some of the most illegal things on earth. Up until today, I had only used it for learning how to code and commit small crimes. But after the horrifying videos I just found, I don't think I'll ever use the dark web again. I first met my best friend Alex when a little bit after I got into high school. My parents had moved us to a new town and I had no friends. It was lonely at first, but I got used to it. We moved because they were paranoid after many murders occurred in our town. I thought this was weird, moving across the country over that, but I let it go. The reason Alex and I became friends so quickly was because we both had a shared interest in the internet and everything it had to offer. I was a gaming addict and a Tier 3 Pokemon subscriber, while he was more of a coder and developer. 2 years later, we were still best friends. But now, we were much older and smarter. Alex had discovered the dark web and he was obsessed with it. He pretty much spent every hour of the day on it, searching through anything you could imagine. There was nothing wrong with this, but one search he made was the biggest mistake of his entire life. I remember waking up to dozens of text messages from him one morning. This wasn't normal. Alex wasn't a very social person, and it was very hard to get words out of him. I opened my phone to see what he had messaged me. "Dude, Jack, you have to come over right now. This is important. Jack, please wake up. This is urgent. Where are you?" These were only some of the messages, but the rest were very similar, with them all being urgent, and that I needed to go to his house immediately. My parents were both at work still, so I went over to Alex's house. When I arrived, there were 4 cop cars parked in front of his house, and there were dozens of people and news vans standing out front. I made my way through the crowd, and Alex's mother told the police to let me inside. I could see tears rolling down her cheeks as she opened the door. "What's going on, Mrs. Gonzalez?" I asked. "Alex missing," she said as she started crying. My heart sank. How could this happen? He had just texted me earlier that morning. That was when it hit me. What if he was trying to warn me? What if his text messages were related to his disappearance? Still in shock, I walked up to one of the detectives in the kitchen. "Is Alex going to be okay?" I asked. "Of course he is. He's going to be just fine. We're going to find him very soon," one of the detectives responded. Something about that response was off. It was like I knew he was wrong. Deep down, I had this slight feeling that I wasn't going to see him ever again. I remembered the text messages, however, and pulled out my phone to show it to the detective. "He texted me this morning. What if this has something to do with him going missing?" I said swiftly, as he began reading them. His expression quickly changed. It was like it got worse. He told me they needed to keep my phone for now to investigate the text messages, and said they would give it back to me later. I stayed around the house for a while, not just because I missed Alex, but because I wanted to comfort his parents. They cared about me a lot, and it hurt to see them like that. His mother couldn't stop crying. Eventually, however, I went into Alex's room to see if I could find anything that might give a clue about why he went missing. I searched through everything, but I found nothing. But then I noticed something. Alex's computer was on, but his monitor was turned off. I looked for the button to turn it on and hit it. As the screen lit up, my heart sank. He was on the dark web. Obviously, this was normal, but for some reason, he had dozens of different tabs open. I knew this part wasn't normal, so I closed the door and locked it, and began going through them. At first, it was all pretty usual for him, but then things started to get weird. He had a tab open that was an article about a murder that had happened several years ago. The article said that it was a woman who was found dead in her apartment. Her body was mutilated, cut up, and covered in acid. I nearly threw up reading it and seeing the horrifying pictures of the crime scene. Not wanting to see any of it anymore, I switched the tab, just to reveal another article about another murder. Confused, I quickly went through the rest of the tabs he had open. And they were all the same thing. They all were about some type of murder or crime. The one that stuck out the most to me, however, was one about a murder that had happened 2 years ago. At first it seemed pretty normal, but as I read further, I realized what it was. It was about the murder of our neighbor that prompted us to move away. Confusion quickly swept over me. How did Alex know about this? I never told him about it. Because to me, it wasn't that important. I figured it must have just been a strange coincidence. But then I saw the last search he had made on his computer. It was my last name. Horrified and confused, I quickly stumbled out of his room and back to the living room. "Is everything all right?" Alex's mother said, sniffing away her tears. "Yeah, I just need to go home for dinner," I responded. On the way home, so many questions and thoughts filled my mind. Why was he searching up my last name? Did he think that I had something to do with this? That must have been why he was texting me so frantically that morning. If only I could just explain to him that I didn't do anything wrong. But I couldn't. He was still missing, and I had to find out why. When I got home, I raced to my room and slammed the bedroom door shut and got on my computer. I loaded up my Tor browser and turned my VPN on. I knew what I had to do. I began typing in the letters of my last name, becoming more nervous after every letter. When I finally hit enter, nothing happened. It was just a blank screen. Confused, I refreshed the page, but once again, there was nothing. But why did Alex search this if there was nothing? I thought to myself, there must be something out there. I was getting ready to close the tab, thinking I had ran into a dead end, when suddenly, the page started to load. It took several minutes, but finally, it loaded to reveal hundreds of videos. Immediately, I knew what they were. They were murders. But why did they show up when you searched my last name? I considered just stopping right there and turning back, knowing the horrifying things I would see if I continued on. But I couldn't. I knew this had to be why Alex went missing. So I clicked on the first video. As it started playing, I saw what looked like a woman strapped to a chair in some sort of basement or something. I quickly recognized who it was. It was our neighbor from 2 years ago. I could tell because she had the same heart-shaped tattoo on her neck. She sat there for a minute, struggling, panicking, and screaming for someone to help. However, suddenly, 2 figures walked into frame. At first, I couldn't tell who they were, but as they turned around to face the camera, my heart sank. It was my parents. My father was holding a knife, while my mother was holding a small scalpel. They paused for a moment before they started what was the most horrifying 5 minutes of my entire life. I watched as they cut her into pieces, and listened as she begged for mercy, screaming the whole time. Blood filled the room as she took her last breath. When the video ended, it quickly went to another, revealing the exact same room and chair I had seen before. I was traumatized by what I had already seen, and I knew I couldn't watch any more of it. My parents were murderers, and I now knew the real reason we moved away 2 years ago. I knew there was something off about that, but I just never could have imagined that this was the horrifying secret that they had been hiding from me. This whole time I thought Alex was trying to accuse me of being responsible for these murders. But I was so wrong. He was trying to warn me. I scanned through more of the videos, each in the exact same room. I was just about finished. ready to go to the police so that I could tell them about what I had just seen when I noticed something. There was a new video uploaded today on the website. I quickly clicked on it and pressed play to reveal what looked like a man this time. Strapped to the chair, he had a sack over his face, and I couldn't tell who it was. Once again, however, I saw my parents walk into the frame. My father walked up to the man and pulled the sack off his head. At first, I couldn't tell who it was, but then I realized who I was looking at. It was Alex. Story: My Unsolved Cases, Imaginary Friend. Hey, so I'm glad you all liked reading about my last case. It really helps me pass the time nowadays. Well, like I said, I'll stay in chronological order. So this next case came up about a year and a half after the last one. At this point, I've been on the force for about 5 years. So this case is unique for 2 reasons. This is the only case I will write about that has, legally, been solved. But I'm not so sure, and this was my first case that I could actually respond to in real time. Because it was called in to my local department. Anyways, I guess I'll just hop right into it. So I'm just drinking coffee passing the time. It was around 9:30 p.m. by this point. When we get this call, our department actually plays any local emergency calls they get over an intercom in the detectives department. They do this so that we can form an opinion in real time. It helps us out a lot when we arrive on the scene. Any detectives will know what I'm talking about. Anyways, I was the only detective on duty. There were 3 of us currently employed with the department, and this call came in over the speaker. It started off as most do. Some panicked person barely able to get out a coherent sentence. Then the operator asks the person to calm down so that she can better understand. It took this man about 2 minutes, longer than usual, to calm down enough to be able to speak audibly. Like I did on the last story, I'll just give you the transcript, but I'll skip to the part where you can actually understand what he's saying. Operator: Okay, sir. So again, tell me your emergency. Victim: Name blurred out. Okay. I can do this. He breathes out heavily. Okay. So I was just making sure all of the doors in my house were locked before I went to bed. But when I got to my back door, I saw a shadowed silhouette of a man. I was in disbelief. I thought it was just a tree's shadow that I was looking at funny. But I went upstairs to take a look, just to be sure. When I got upstairs, takes another deep breath. His voice was trembling this whole time. When I got upstairs, I looked down and had a better visual of what I was looking at. It was definitely a man, and he was staring straight at me. All I could see were his eyes, and he was looking straight at mine. Operator: Is he still there, sir? Victim: I don't know. I ran into the closet out of fear. Should I go check? Operator: No, sir. Stay where you are. I am sending a squad car now. Victim: Okay, I'm just going to take a quick peek outside. Operator: Sir, please stay where you are. Help is on their way. This is where I ran to one of the 2 squad cars that we departing the station to answer the call. Luckily, I didn't miss any dialogue because the man just agreed and stayed put in his closet. A couple more minutes passed. We were nearing the scene and the victim started talking again. Victim: I just heard something. I think he's on my porch. I'm going to check. Operator: Sir, please stay where you are. Victim. He's still here. Leave. He screamed this in desperation from his window. The man was really beginning to lose his mind during all of this. Operator. Sir, get back in the closet. Victim. Okay, I'm back. I'm back. He was still in the same spot. He hasn't even moved. Why hasn't he moved? This is when we arrived. The only reason I was allowed to answer this call is because the department recently allowed it after we pressed our chief because of the value of real-time evidence. We walked upstairs and found the man trembling in his closet, clutching his cell phone for dear life. He began screaming, "Did you find him? Did you find him?" We had one cop searching the perimeter, and he radioed in saying he found nothing. We asked this man to show us where he had seen the intruder. He hesitantly took us out to the backyard where we proceeded to find nothing. This was typical of an intruder call. We could never find the criminal on the initial call. But this was different. It was different because the man who made the call started screaming bloody murder. He began yelling, "Do you not see him? He's looking right at me. Arrest him, please." We looked at him baffled and asked him what he was talking about. He responded louder than before, "Do you not see him? He's looking right at me. You're right next to him." This proceeded for another 5 minutes, and it eventually led to us taking him into the station to be evaluated. This was the first time I was able to witness a psychiatric evaluation. The interview was eerie. You could tell this man had been shaken to his core. The unusual thing about this guy was that, unlike every other mentally insane person brought in for questioning, this guy had no past to make us suspect he was insane. Like I said, this was my first time witnessing this with the force, so I didn't know the difference. Anyways, I'll just paraphrase how their conversation went. Psychiatrist. So tell me, name blurred, what exactly did you see? Victim. Well, sir, He takes a deep breath. I saw a man. He was just looking at me. His eyes were much bigger than a normal human's. Psychiatrist. Normal humans? Victim. Yes, unless he was wearing a mask or something. I don't think this man was human. He didn't have a nose or mouth, just eyes, and they would come off of me. Psychiatrist. Okay, son. What else can you tell me? Victim. Well, when the police came to help, they walked all around this man, and the man didn't even acknowledge that they were there. He just kept eye contact with me. The interview continues like this for a little while longer, and after it was over, the psychiatrist came into the room where the 2 other detectives and I were sitting. The other detectives had been called in by this point. So, he tells us that, even after hearing what the victim said, he doesn't believe he is lying. He told us that this man genuinely believed what he told us was true. And judging by what he told us, the psychiatrist determined the man must have been psychotic. We talked to the man the next morning and told him that he was going to be sent to a psych ward for the next 2 months for rehabilitation. We sent him off, and I didn't hear, nor did I even think about the case for the next 2 months. I just wrote him off as crazy. 2 months pass, and we are told in our morning briefing that the man was released and was supposedly no longer mentally unstable. It didn't take the man more than 12 hours to call us. Literally that night he called in complaining about the same thing. I wasn't working during this time, but the detective who was filled me in, and from what I heard, It was basically the same thing that happened with me. The detective told me that they warned the man that if he made one more false call, then they were going to have to arrest him. I guess this scared the man off for a day. But just 3 nights after being released, he called again. Luckily, I was working during this call. While I was in the car heading towards the man's house, I was listening in on his call with our operator. I have since lost this call's transcript, but I do remember one thing about this call. In fact, I'll never forget it. This man had been calling from the same closet that he did when we first responded. And he had that same panicked voice, describing that same ominous figure. Only this time, instead of claiming the man was outside, he began yelling bloody murder. Just like in The Dancing Man case, when the victim yelled so loud that the phone call became muffled. The same thing happened here. The man was all calm in his closet, just waiting for the police to arrive, when he says something like, "Wait, what was that?" The operator pressed him to stay in the closet and he just ignored it. I heard him open his closet door and take what might have been 2 steps before silence fell over the call. The silence was broken when the operator started questioning the man and asking him what he was looking at. The man just responded ever so softly, He's right in front of me." Silence once again came over the call, and was once again broken by the operator. She was begging the man to respond to her. He never did, and we arrived on the scene 3 minutes later. We walked upstairs to his closet. As we were walking, I noticed that every access point, including the back door, was closed and locked. We got up to the scene and saw just the victim, dead after drowning in his own blood. His throat was cut, and after 3 days of investigating the crime scene, the department declared it a suicide. I pleaded with them not to close the case so quickly, but it was no use. It looks bad when a department reports an unsolved homicide. I doubt that this was a suicide for 2 reasons. 1, and probably the more obvious reason, a suicide weapon was never found. And 2, I got a good look at the victim and his dead body. His throat was cut open all right, but not by a knife. The cut was rough. It looked almost forced, almost like someone cut his neck with their fingernail. Anyways, that obviously isn't enough evidence to overturn a suicide ruling. But I knew, and I think the other detectives did too. The vibe in the office was just eerie for the next couple of days. The creepiest part was when we asked the psych ward that we sent him to for their evaluation reports on him. We read them, and every time the doctor would give him the same evaluation. He would talk about how the man acted immature, and was just acting under the stress of daily life. But at the end of every report, all 10 of them, he would put the same sentence. Seems completely stable. Just can't get over his imaginary friend. Corpse singer. I first met Jerry DuPont in 1986. I was a beat cop and new to the force, while Jerry was a mortician, or rather the assistant to one. We didn't have much in common, apart from our love of stories and our proximity to death. Despite that, we became friends and often met at the Rose and Crown to have a drink after work and regale one another with largely exaggerated stories. DuPont had grown up fairly well off. You could tell by the way he carried himself. He was stylish, always opting to dress up for the occasion rather than to dress down. And no matter how straight and rigid his posture was, Jerry always managed to look more at ease in a suit jacket and tie than I ever did in a t-shirt and jeans. One of the first stories Jerry DuPont ever told me at The Rose and Crown was the story of his life. And I was deeply interested in the family history he told me. His parents had died early, and all that was left was his trust fund, and a gold ring with a black onyx face that he wore on his left-hand pinky. It was the perfect detail to punctuate the tragedy of his youth. It wasn't until his teenage years when the narrative lines he'd laid before me began to cross over one another and I saw the nature of the game and the rules he'd set between us. I was suddenly less than certain of the accuracy surrounding the death of his parents and the origin of the ring. But the light deceit wasn't off-putting. Instead, I found it freeing. Jerry and I were able to express ourselves to one another with far more candor. When the truth was tied in and around hyperbole, his willingness to sit and share his mind with me was a balm to the machismo of my day job. And I felt like sparking a friendship with him would be worth more to me than the overtime I was sacrificing by meeting him semi-frequently at The Rose and Crown. And so we began to meet more regularly. We spent those evenings talking, laughing, and drinking well past my bedtime. Unlike me, Jerry was naturally inclined to love the night, and would often invite the chance to extend our time together well past the closing of the pub. Sometimes we'd continue our discussion, or the continuation of a tall tale. But often we'd just revel in the company of one another. I soon began to notice that Jerry had an analytical, almost cold, and calculated mind. Sometimes I would describe to him a case I had heard about or was working on, and presented it to him as if he were the detective to be, and not myself. Exercising that part of his brain thrilled him. You could see the pleasure it gave him plaster on his face. More often than not, he was able to spin the puzzle in such a way as to find the solution with an ease that was almost elegant in its nonchalance. When I asked him on one of our late-night walks after the pub had closed how he managed to deduce the solution with such eerie accuracy, he stated plainly, "You look for the why above all. You always have. How could you not? You arrive at the scene of the crime, and are confronted with all angles and aspects of the case. You see the corpse as a human, someone who lived in the home they were killed in, comfortably and only hours before. I only listened then, and didn't speak a word." We continued to walk as DuPont left me without resolution to my question. He let me ponder his criticism quietly, before stopping suddenly beside a large maple tree, with our feet buried beneath the fallen leaves, and continuing, "I arrive at work, and put my vulcanized rubber apron on. I put my gloves on. I arrange my tools, my saws and scalpels. I turn on my tape recorder and begin to dissect. I see the plain truth of a person laid out before. I open the window of their soul with a sternal saw, and I peer inside. I can see all there is to someone. From above them, they can't lie to me, just like they can't lie to God." I was left wordless, as he seemed to ponder the truth of his own words, as if he had never asked the question of himself that I had. DuPont shrugged and sighed before quietly stating, "The corpses sing to me." The words would have been poetic, had they not chilled me to the bone. He looked away from me, staring down the barely lit street, peering into the darkness. His eyes looked empty, and lost in some near-forgotten memory. I saw him for the first time. The duality of DuPont, a person who could coldly put things together, and another who just as coldly took them apart. I grabbed him by the shoulder to shake him from wherever he'd drifted off to, and continued walking. It took a moment for him to follow, and the rest of the night drifted from one topic to another. Astronomy gave way to galaxies, gave way to the texture of the universe, and in there we found morality defined by evolving philosophy until weariness claimed and I said my goodnight to DuPont and caught a taxi home. By 1991, I had become a detective, with no help from DuPont, I might add, as I surely could have done so sooner had I relied on him more. But I wanted to achieve the rank on my own merits. DuPont had taught me much about the impartiality of deduction, and I was grateful for it, although sometimes I found myself envious of the inhuman ease his mind moved around murder. I only wonder now if it was because of Jerry DuPont or in spite of him that I became a detective. One morning in the early morning dews of October, DuPont came to me with a newspaper rolled tightly and tucked under his arm. He had a skip to his step as he met me uncharacteristically for coffee. As he sat, with no foreword, he pulled the newspaper between us and pointed his fingers to the headline. It read, Vancouver, British Columbia, October 8, 1992. A cloud of fear and uncertainty has descended upon the residents of a rundown social housing apartment building called Rue du Chagrin in Vancouver, as a shocking and unsolved murder case continues to baffle both residents, as well as local law enforcement. The incident, which occurred last week, has left investigators grasping for clues in the aftermath of a brutal and possibly premeditated crime. The victim, a 53-year-old divorcee named Anna Stillwater, was discovered in her unit on the 13th floor by a concerned neighbor who had not seen her for several days, and noticed a foul odor emanating from the apartment. The gruesome scene that awaited the neighbor was one of chaos, with the apartment tossed about, broken glass littering the floor, and chairs overturned. Ms. Stillwater lay on the floor in a pool of her own blood, with her throat slashed. More alarmingly, the assailant had made off with valuable jewelry, suggesting a possible motive of robbery turned deadly. What makes this case even more confusing for police has been the lack of any discernible entry point for the assailant. As stated anonymously by someone close to the case, the apartment's door was found locked from the inside, and investigators have yet to identify any signs of forced entry, leaving the possibility that the attacker was already inside when Anna Stillwater arrived home before the crime was committed. Despite the apparent lack of forensic evidence pointing to an intruder, the local police force remains resolute in their pursuit of the truth. Detective Sarah Reynolds, who is heading the investigation, stated, "We are exploring every avenue of investigation and are committed to bringing the perpetrator to justice. This case presents unique challenges, but we will leave no stone unturned." Intriguingly, the victim's landlord, John Miller, when asked to comment on the situation by local reporters, expressed his sympathy for the victim and their family, but also hinted at a possible motive. Miller stated that Ms. Stillwater had been consistently late with her rent payments and often had to seek loans, leading to some speculation that financial troubles may have played a role in the tragic events. Authorities are taking Miller's statement seriously, and it is now an integral part of the ongoing investigation. Detectives are delving into Ms. Stillwater's financial history and potential connections to determine if any debts or conflicts may have contributed to her untimely demise. As the investigation continues, the community remains on edge, struggling to comprehend the violent incident that occurred within the confines of their modest and tight-knit apartment building. Local residents have expressed shock and concern for their own safety, with many calling for increased security measures in the building. For now, the shadow of this unsolved murder hangs over the neighborhood, and the search for answers is ongoing. When I finished reading the newspaper's account of the event I already knew too well, DuPont said nothing. There was a tension between us. That was new to me, and as I looked at him, he stared back at me with that faraway, calculating inhuman look, his mind working busily in front of me, while his gaze peered through me to someplace far away. Finally, he asked me what I thought knowing, somehow, that I was assigned to the case. I told him I agreed with my superior detective Reynolds that it was a complicated and unique case, unable to say much else. "You're wrong," he said flatly, his eyes snapping into focus. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't more than a little insulted by the tactless assertion he'd made plainly to my face. I rested back into my chair, my coffee sending swirls of steam between us, as I crossed my arms, trying as best I could to not get defensive as my ego withered inside me. All credit due to DuPont. He let me stew, and gave me ample opportunity to assert myself. But I didn't, as much pride as I took in my job as a detective. I knew that he had uncanny abilities that I simply wasn't born with. I gave him a terse nod, and he spoke. "Ms. Stillwater slashed her own throat," he said, and no more. I was as perplexed as I was disappointed. I had come to know DuPont as a person with a mind as sharp as a razor. And yet there we were, sitting before me, dashing all illusions I'd had of him until that moment. "No," I said, "the jewelry was missing and the apartment was ransacked. Not to mention the difficulty she would have had sawing through her own throat with a serrated steak knife." I thought to myself. Like a little boy, his eyes lit up, and I realized now I'd taken the bait. Already on edge, I didn't appreciate the frivolity and joy DuPont took in that moment, and felt the hair on my neck raise as I smelt the same psychosis in him that I saw in the many murders I'd investigated at that point in my career. Resting his elbows on the table and crossing his fingers, he began once more to outlay his theory in more detail. Ms. Stillwater frequently missed rent payments. This must have been frustrating for the landlord, Mr. Miller, so he gives her a final ultimatum: pay your rent or get out. She has few belongings, save for the jewelry she received as gifts from her husband before they separated. It's her safety net. In fear she's going to lose her place, she pawns them off to make rent, and pays Mr. Miller, but is just short of the total amount owing. So the landlord changes the locks without her knowing, but she returns home early and finds Mr. Miller outside her apartment. She's unaware he's just changed the locks. She only sees her apartment door open and Mr. Miller leaving her unit. Assuming he's come to serve her with an eviction notice, she rushes into her apartment and closes the door behind her, only noticing once she's on the inside and hears the lock click from the other side that the second lock beneath the deadbolt has been changed. Mr. Miller knowing she has adult children. Tells her to call one of them to come and pay the remaining rent owed. And leaves her locked in her apartment. It was only then that DuPont paused for the first time. To catch his breath. Why didn't she just call the police? I asked. That's unlawful imprisonment. DuPont smiled at me, and I only resented him more in that moment. Despite our friendship, it felt as though he was gloating now as he continued to make his wild assertions. Ms. Stillwater refrained from calling the police because she was afraid that they would have her removed from the apartment. It isn't rational to think that would be the case in her circumstance. But also she feared she'd be homeless. Ms. Stillwater also refused to call her children because of pride. She's their mother and would never want them to take care of her. That's her job to take care of them. No, instead she stays in the apartment and wages a silent wage of attrition. Knowing she has enough food to outlast the cruelty of Mr. Miller. The only problem is the building itself. It's derelict. The owners are slumlords. There's a CO2 leak in the apartment, and Ms. Stillwater begins to find herself short of breath. She's breathing, but the feeling of drowsiness overcomes her, and her heart rate increases. No matter how hard she tries to breathe in deeply, she feels as though she's suffocating. Ms. Stillwater rushes to the door, but it's locked. She's getting dizzy and crashes about her apartment. As she falls back on her instincts to survive, she thrashes about the apartment, tossing chairs and smashing the pictures on the walls. Finally, when she exhausted all options, she grabs a steak knife and begins trying to give herself a tracheotomy. It's the only thing she can think of, but she digs too deep and she loses balance as the apartment swims around her and her vision starts to go. She falls and her elbow crashes into the ground with the knife tip underneath her skin. The force drives the serrated knife through ligaments and tendons and is sent skittering across the floor away from where she lies bleeding out on the floor. It would have been impossible for him to know any of what he claimed to be certain. There were simply too many assertions being made, but at the same time I was unsettled to know that somehow my friend had been aware of case details we had kept under tight wraps and away from the press, such as the fact that a serrated knife had been used. Could my friend, Jerry DuPont, the sharpest mind I'd ever met, be the killer? I'd known him so long, and yet there was always the underlying lack of humanity. Could he be toying with me? I thought to myself at that moment, using our standing rapport to set our sights away from himself, and make her a victim of circumstance and cruelty? I countered then, trying to shake my mind free of the suspicion. Her fingerprints weren't on the knife. I said, feeling the tension loosen from my shoulders as his version of events crumbled before me. Then, without a pause, he said, "The cat licked it clean." But there was no cat. The building was pet-free, and I felt a burst of laughter ripple through my chest at the absurdity of the claim. DuPont looked at me. I could tell he didn't take kindly to my reaction, and wasn't used to my dismissal. I'd never once in all our years questioned his deductive mind. He slammed his hands on the table, startling me as I fell quiet, before quickly placing them in his lap, ashamed at his own out-of-character burst of emotion. Mr. Miller came to check on Ms. Stillwater, unlocking the door and letting the scent of her bloated body out into the hallway, alerting her neighbors. And in the process let her cat, which she was not allowed to have, out of the apartment. I simply shook my head. It was too ridiculous. I offered my friend an olive branch, suggesting he needed more sleep, or that he was perhaps bored with his own work and had begun daydreaming, and that he should pick up a hobby not centered around death, I suggested. Once again, in a dismissive tone, I look back on with shame. Check the pawn shops in the area. Ask the neighbor. Check the keys in evidence, they won't match the door. Talk to her friends and see for yourself that she had a cat. He said in a huff as he stood up, pushing his chair over in humiliation due to how I was treating him. I was stubborn in that moment, refusing to assuage his hurt feelings, remembering the tall tales we used to tell one another, the Rose and Crown, but as he walked away I couldn't help myself, and asked him how he could be so certain such a ridiculous story could be true. He turned, his face red, and said, "Her corpse sang for me." We didn't speak after that. I visited his work a time or two, thinking it best to smooth things over and apologize, but he refused to see me, having ordered his secretary to turn me away on sight regardless of the matter. And it wasn't until a year later, with little movement in the case, that I thought to bring DuPont's versions of events to Detective Reynolds. We were at our wits' end. The case was largely forgotten by the media, but we still worked diligently on it in our spare time. Until one morning, in a meeting, I offhandedly mentioned the conversation I'd had with DuPont as I was deep in the throes of nostalgia, thinking of my old friend, as I often did when the Stillwater case came up. And while the version of events might have seemed too far-fetched to me when DuPont had laid it out before me, as I worked on the case up close, with the distance of time, no theory became too outlandish. Detective Reynolds was furious I'd not brought this detail to her sooner. But I explained just how insane it had seemed, quickly, as if every minute counted, as if the gruesome scene were still fresh, and any minute wasted was an opportunity we might lose forever. Ordered an exhumation to have another autopsy performed. She called in a pair of beat cops and instructed them to canvass the apartment complex to determine if she had a cat, and took off towards the evidence room to determine if the keys we took into evidence from within the apartment matched the second deadbolt on the outside of the door. And as she walked away, Detective Reynolds called back to me and ordered me to bring Jerry DuPont in for questioning. I felt cold sweat seep from my skin as I realized what I had done. I could see it in the change of her demeanor. Detective Reynolds could see the headlines already. Star Detective Solved Death of Stillwater. But the headline, Star Detective Catches Mastermind Murderer, was far more attractive in the eyes of the ambitious lead detective. And I knew that she meant to try it all together in some elaborate way as to benefit in a more grand, newsworthy fashion. But what could I do? She was my superior and ordered me to bring in Jerry DuPont. It was early evening, and I parked outside the back of the funeral home where the adjoined morgue was attached by a covered outdoor walkway, and saw Jerry DuPont buttoned up in a dress shirt and tie, beneath his rubber apron on the way back from the morgue. DuPont squinted in the light and was less than pleased to see me exit the vehicle. As he started walking briskly away, I called after him, ordering him to stop or I would charge him with impeding an investigation. That hurt him as much as it hurt me. I'm sick with myself thinking back on this moment. It was a bluff, but all men fear authority in one way or another, and despite his deductive intellect, he was too shocked to see through my deceit. The drive back to the station was quiet and uncomfortable. I tried to explain as best I could what it was that I had done. That time had shown me that his claim wasn't so preposterous and that I was sorry. But he simply turned his head away, and I was unsure if he heard me. Detective Reynolds conducted the interrogation, and I wondered at my desk how she would react to DuPont if he claimed the corpses sang to him in front of her. I didn't see him leave, but Detective Reynolds walked past my desk, rapping her knuckles on the surface, and told me I'd done a good job today. For a moment I felt pleased with myself, until I concluded that the context of her compliment was that DuPont might have said something to implicate himself on record without requesting his lawyer be present. The next day, I went to see DuPont. Hoping to sit and talk with him, I wanted to apologize and help set things right. But once again, I was turned away by the receptionist, claiming he'd called into work sick. This did little to ease my mind. By that point, Detective Reynolds was most likely already speaking with a judge to get an arrest warrant. Or at least that was my fear. Regardless of DuPont's wish that I not see or speak with him, I knew I needed to help my friend and make right the wrongs I'd unintentionally done. As I left the receptionist at the desk and got back into my car, I knew there wasn't a moment to waste. I drove round back, parking my vehicle out of sight of the front foyer of the funeral home, and got out. I pulled a set of lock-picking tools from my glove box and quietly ran to the morgue where I knew he'd be toiling away, and prepared myself for the stench of death and preservation chemicals that would bombard me the moment the door swung open. I looked about, realizing that was the first time I felt the anxiety of crime in my life. I felt the tools catch in the lock and make their way deeper, one small tooth at a time, until the lock clicked and opened. The room was dark save for a single light that hung over a stainless steel table in the middle of the room. DuPont wasn't there, but it was also the first time I'd ever stepped inside of the morgue. It felt odd to me that although DuPont had taught me so much about myself, I knew little save for that brief family history he'd once told me. I walked around and examined the blood and bile-encrusted drain at the foot of the steel table. The curiosity was simply too much, and although I knew this was an invasion of his privacy, I was not there as part of the police but as a friend, and so I excused myself. His tools, the saws, and pipes, and scalpels all sat on a table pushed against a wall. They were meticulously ordered and cleaned, gleaming under the harsh overhead light. I could feel the cold of the polished tile floor seep up through the bottom of my boots, and my breath hung in the refrigerated air. And that's when I heard a whisper, small and faint, hardly louder than the hum of the fluorescent light. It sounded like a human voice spoken through the end of a balloon. Whiny and drawn out, escaping air instead of spoken words. I felt crawling terror wriggle its way up my spine. I could see I was alone, but where had the noise originated? Then again, the smallest whine, like a human voice, spoken through the end of a balloon, as if it was escaping a vacuum. The words were indiscernible. I looked low under tables and in the trash. I felt silly, as though I was playing a morbid game of hide and seek. But still, I couldn't tell where the sound was coming from. Finally, I came to the wall where the tiny square refrigerator's doors stood closed in 2 neat rows of 8. I placed my ear to each one by one, praying that I heard nothing. And one by one, I came away having heard nothing, but too afraid to open them, until I came to the final refrigerator door in the bottom right of the wall. I felt bile burn the back of my tongue and the insides of my teeth, leaving them raw and gritty as I heard the whine from inside. And a little squeal of fear escaped from my throat. I knew I needed to open the door and see what was inside, but fear kept me from doing just that. I'll admit I'm a coward, because in that moment I found I didn't naturally have the courage to face my fear. Even worse, my mind would not make heads or tails of what it was exactly that I was afraid to confront. I was shaking by then, and I'd love to say it was from the cold of the refrigerator room. But it was not. It was only with the brief invasive thought that DuPont might be trapped inside. That I found it within myself to grip the handle tight and yank it open. It opened soundlessly, and a gush of flesh-infused air gushed out at me. I could taste the body rotting slowly within, and had to stop myself from gagging. I could see bare feet facing me, and wanted to turn tail and run. But it was then I heard the whine again, the sound of escaping air, and without thinking too hard about what I was about to do, I grabbed hold of the end of the tray and yanked. The body came into the light and I gasped. It was Jerry DuPont, my friend, stark naked and dead. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My friend, who I'd spent many nights with talking and laughing, there in the corpse refrigerator, with both his pale, rigged hands wrapped around a knife plunged into his heart, expertly slipped sideways between the ribs to the left of his sternum. I fell to my knees dumbfounded, and tears welled in my eyes. I felt the hot regret of our last two encounters, and wanted to bash myself in the face with my own curled fists until I was senseless. I hung my head low and cried. I couldn't hold back my emotions no matter how hard I tried. I felt responsible for his death, not truly understanding what I was doing when I put forth the theory he'd told me a year previous. Why had I not claimed it was my own absurd concoction? And then I heard it again. That small whine, long and drawn out. It was coming from DuPont's dead body. It was the gas bloating his belly, escaping from his lips. Is this what he'd meant when he said the corpses sing for him? Inconsolable in my grief, and out of my mind with guilt, I bent down, hoping to hear the soft words of my friend's voice one more time. I stayed like that, frozen in place for an indeterminate length of time, until the gas from his body broke free once more, escaping through his throat and past his lips. RRRRRYYYYNOLLLLLDSSSSSS. I fell back, shocked and breathless. I knew I must be past my wits in shock. But I could have sworn I heard him speak a name. I know it seems odd and macabre, but I sat there a little while longer, hoping to hear the gas whine and run past his lips once more, resolved that what I heard was merely a trick of the mind. But his body now lay quiet and deflated. DuPont was simply dead. I walked slowly to my car and radioed the station, alerting them of DuPont's death. I chose not to wait for them to arrive and instead returned home in a daze. I called in sick to work the next day, unable to face the reality of the situation. I was grief-stricken, unlike anything I'd ever felt before. But I did turn on the TV to see Reynolds giving a press conference in regards to the Stillwater case. It played out much like I had suspected, but only Detective Reynolds held back no punches. With DuPont dead, she was free to make whatever claims fit the narrative, as he was no longer alive to refute them. He was the murderer, and he'd confessed to a friend on the force a year earlier, according to Reynolds. As she put it, the absurdity of the case made it impossible to solve with rational minds. And the culprit, Jerry DuPont, was as insane, sick and twisted as he was brilliant. At least he got that. Knowing the cops were closing in, he opted to take his own life in as dramatic a fashion as his elaborate murder of Ms. Stillwater had been. In order to escape justice and the consequences of his actions, I was disgusted listening to her on the television, and was glad for the 2 weeks paid vacation I received for my trauma. I don't think I could have stomached the lies when they were fresh. And I'm ashamed I tolerated them at all. I'm a coward. I feared losing my job, a job I'd worked hard for and was proud of, but I let my friend's good name be tarnished. Upon returning to work, though, Reynolds called me into her office one last time, before she was promoted and transferred to a national position for the RCMP. I think she was congratulating me, or telling me to keep my mouth shut. I couldn't tell. My eyes were transfixed on a small gold ring with a black onyx face sitting innocently among the stacks of papers on her desk. Detective Reynolds was as capable as she was ambitious, and I needed no convincing to know what she had done. I saw a shrunken head in a museum, and I think I recognized it. I never knew my mother. I was only 8 months old when she died. Well, when she was murdered. I don't know much else about it. In fact, I didn't even know she was murdered until 2 years ago when I was 15. You see, my dad doesn't like to talk about her at all, and so he never discussed why she was no longer with us. I have seen photos of her, and so I know what she looks like. But I wasn't told much about her. I always thought that she died of a sickness or maybe in a freak accident. So I was very surprised when I found out that she had been murdered. I wish that my father would talk about it more, though, because I want to know how it happened. I have heard a few rumors at school about how she died. I overheard one kid say that she was kidnapped and held for ransom before being killed when my dad didn't pay. Another kid told me that she was decapitated, and her head was never found. So I really didn't know what to believe, and I couldn't ask my dad to fill in the details. Ever since I found out about my mother's fate, however, I have become overly interested in true crime, and I especially enjoy learning about unsolved mysteries. That's how I found out about the strange museum that suddenly appeared in my town. My friend, Ellie, had first told me about it. Have you seen that museum that opened in the old library? She asked me one day at lunchtime. I replied that I hadn't seen it and that I didn't know anything about it. So she went on to explain what it was. I heard that it is a museum that is all about famous murder cases and has a lot of exhibits that feature real crime scene photos and even a few items that were taken from murder sites. She explained, I'm going there on Saturday. Did you want to come? I thought about it for a moment, but then remembered that I had planned to spend the day with Dad. So I had to tell her that I couldn't make it, which she seemed disappointed about. I thought about this museum for the rest of the school day, and I begun to wonder what crimes would have exhibits. Maybe they will have an exhibit for my mom. I thought, maybe I could find out more about her murder. I thought long and hard about whether or not I should try and go to the museum, and finally, I decided that I would go on Sunday. My dad was going out of town that day for work, so it was the perfect time to go. I spent the rest of the week leading up to Sunday both excited and nervous. I was excited because I knew that I would find the museum very interesting, but nervous because I didn't know exactly what to expect. When Sunday finally rolled around, I was more excited than nervous. My dad left early on Sunday morning, so I knew I had most of the day to explore the mysterious museum without him seeing me there. I got up at around 8:30 and got dressed and ready for my day. I then walked across town to where the library used to be. I soon arrived and saw that instead of the sign that used to read, "Town Library," there was now a sign that was freshly painted with the words, "The Murder Museum." There was already a couple of people in the line when I arrived, and so I stood behind them and waited my turn to enter the museum. In front of me was a large man that had a small tattoo of a bird on his cheek. He appeared to also be by himself, and it looked like he was quite excited to go in. He made it to the front of the line and bought a ticket and entered through the front door. It was now my turn, so I walked up to the little booth that had been set up and I approached the younger man sitting inside the booth. The man selling the tickets was around 25, and he had long black hair and a large smile that was filled with crooked, yellow teeth. "Ticket for one, please," I said to the young man and handed over a $10 note that I had gotten from my part-time job. The man took my money, without saying anything, and handed me a small, paper ticket that read, "Admit 1." He then pointed me to the direction of the front door and said, "Enter at your own risk." I walked over to the main door and pushed it open and stepped inside. Not knowing what to expect, what I found inside was mostly old newspaper articles of old murders and old, fading photos of what appeared to be crime scenes. They were all in glass displays, and the displays lined up in a row that led to another door. I looked through each newspaper article, searching for any mention of my mother. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anything about her. Not even a mention of her name was present in any of the newspaper articles. I was disappointed, but I still found it fascinating reading about all of the true crimes that had been committed. I read about Kevin Fuller, the killer who would hide his victims' bodies inside his own private jet, and I read about Terry Sturt, the man who murdered both of his closest friends. I probably spent an hour or so walking down the long line of displays that featured the newspaper articles. I finally made it to the end of the row of newspaper cuttings and found myself standing in front of a small, black door. It was shut, but I had no other way to go but through it. I opened the door, which creaked as I opened it, and I stepped through into the next room. This room had a lot more interesting items. There were displays of old clothing, that, according to the small plaques underneath displays, were clothes that the victims were wearing when they were killed. There were also a few murder weapons that were in small glass cases. There were a few knives, a couple handguns, and even a machete, that apparently were used in various murders. I did find this interesting, but I found myself becoming a little bit overwhelmed. Thinking about all of the victims got me thinking about my own mother. I didn't spend too long in this room because I was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. I moved through the large number of display cases, trying to avoid looking at what was contained inside, and I moved to another door. This one was a bit larger than the previous one, and it was painted a dark red color. I opened the door and stepped into the next room, worried about what I might find. I walked in, and the first thing I noticed was the large glass case that stood in front of me. Inside was a small car, a Volkswagen Golf, I think it was. I quickly read that this car was used to lure victims and then they would be killed inside of the car. I felt chills run down my spine as I learned that people were killed inside of the car that I was currently looking at. I turned away from the car and that's when I saw it. The shrunken head, sitting in a small glass case. Across the other side of the room. I had heard of shrunken heads before and I had seen a few photos of them. But I had never seen one in real life. I excitedly walked over to it and had a look at the small, shriveled head that was staring back at me. I looked at the head and had a sudden sense that I recognized the head. I looked closer, and even though the head was a lot smaller than usual and it was shriveled and it was hard to make out any facial features, I could still tell exactly who this used to be. It was Ellie, my friend from school, who told me about the museum. I knew that she had come here yesterday, and I hadn't spoken to her since. And I suddenly knew that something terrible had happened. I stood there frozen, for a minute, not knowing what to do. What had happened to Ellie? Yesterday, at this museum? Could the same thing happen to me? I didn't even want to think about it. All I knew was that I had to get out of here. I began to run back the way I came and tried to open the dark red-colored door that I had entered through. It was locked from this side. It was only open to people coming through. But you couldn't go back through it once you had already entered. All I could do was keep on going through the museum. No one else was around and I hadn't seen anyone for quite a while. Which was strange, because there were definitely people lining up behind me. I knew that I had to continue. So I ran to the next door that was on the other side of the room. Past the shrunken head, I didn't look at it as I ran past. I made it to the next door. A small green door. I opened it and went through. I could see that this room was empty apart from rows of pots, all sitting on top of small, portable gas stoves. I cautiously approached the first pot and had a look inside. I just had to know what was in there, and once I knew, I really wish I hadn't. Inside the pot, looking back at me, was another head. That was boiling inside of the pot. I could already see that this head was slightly smaller than when I had last seen this. It was the small bird tattoo on the head's face that made me realize who I was looking at. I knew that this man entered before me, and somehow, his head was now getting boiled inside a pot, getting shrunk inside of a pot. Suddenly, there was a noise behind me, and I saw a masked man walk out of a door that was hidden in the corner of this room. He was heading straight towards me and he was holding a machete. I knew that it was now my turn to become just a head. Just a shrunken head. I felt adrenaline racing through my body, and I began to sprint in the opposite direction of the man who was approaching me. I managed to run to the other end of the room, past the row of boiling pots. I saw that there was a small door on this side of the room. I managed to reach it and I looked back and saw that the man with the machete was now gaining on me. He was not far from reaching me now. I turned the doorknob on the door and, luckily, it opened. I felt sunlight hit my face. I was now outside. I was out the back of the library. I kept running, trying to get back to the front of the library and then as far away as possible. I was still expecting the door I had come through to swing open and the masked man to run out. But it never did. I managed to navigate my way back to the front of the library. And once I was back to the front, I saw that there was no lineup of people waiting to enter. I probably wouldn't have stopped to warn them. Even if there was a lineup, I knew that I needed to get as far away from this place as possible, and so that's exactly what I did. I did go to the police about what I experienced, and they rushed down to the museum, just in case what I was saying was true. When the police arrived, the library was empty. Everything was gone. The newspaper cuttings, the weapons, the car, and the shrunken head. I do not know where they all went, but all I know is that they have left my town. Ellie is still classed as missing, and the police say that no one knows what happened to her. But I do. I know what happened. Murder on the Appalachian Trail. Murder on the Appalachian Trail. Holy shit, guys. I'm still trying to process this. And you'll have to forgive me if there are any typos in this because I am currently shaking like a leaf. I saw this site and felt like I would be able to vocalize to some capacity what happened over the past 2 days. But maybe I need to be calling the police? I don't know. I mean, I really don't. Okay, I'm an avid backpacker. I don't live too far away from the Appalachian Trail where it moves through the Blue Ridge Mountains. I'm always going up by myself. I've been doing that for years now, and never have I had a reason to think that I should bring someone else. But after this trip, I'm not sure if I will ever backpack again. I was able to get to my favorite spot just before sunset Monday night. Built a fire, set up my tent, and laid out my food. I was walking down to a spring to filter some water when I swore I heard a high-pitched scream. Typically, it's not uncommon to hear coyotes, bobcats, or other animals that make sounds similar to a human scream. So I just kinda thought that's what I was hearing. But it was still a little unnerving. Something was different about it. Filtering my water and then walking back, I saw a man coming from the east along the At. We were eventually going to cross paths as I had to cross over the trail to head up to my camp. Slowing down his pace, it was obvious he had noticed me. For the most part, encountering other backpackers isn't a big deal. Everyone you meet is friendly, and if you find another solo packer, they welcome a little conversation. So when we did in fact meet up, I offered a smile and said, "Good evening." He said his name was Bradley, and I told him mine. He looked like he had been on the trail for a long while. Black military-style cargo pants, gray t-shirt, black combat boots, and a badass backpack that looked as if it was loaded with everything a person would need to survive in the wild. His hair a reddish-brown, shaggy, and unkempt, which turned into a nearly full beard on his face. Super friendly, though, greeting me with a large grin. Bradley seemed like one of those guys that you instantly become buddies with. We chatted a bit about how long we had been on the trail and whatnot. As I suspected, he had hiked for nearly a month. Said he was taking a month off from life before heading back into reality again. He seemed so genuine. I have to admit I was taken by his charisma too, and I felt like we had been old pals for ages. Asking if he could camp with me, I felt no reason not to let him. Watching him unpack his tent and equipment, I realized how efficient he was. It almost seemed military in a way. Everything organized and neat as he laid out his belongings in a way that appeared mechanical. As if he had performed those motions hundreds of times. After he completed his setup, which really only took moments, he made himself some coffee over my fire and we chatted about typical things. As the night progressed, I noticed him becoming less talkative, staring into the fire or gazing up at the sky, all the while sipping his coffee. Eventually, I decided to turn in, and he said he would do the same. It was about 3 a.m. and I heard his tent unzip. It was a little cold and I remember specifically the sound of the laces on his boots being tightened. But after that I didn't hear him walking around. I assumed he had to relieve himself after all that coffee. But all I could hear was the night breeze sweeping over the highlands. Thinking about it now, I am literally feeling sick at my stomach. Fuck me. Okay, so I'm laying there nearly on the verge of sleep again when I hear far in the distance what I know for certain now was the sound of a man screaming. In absolute horror, the scream echoed throughout the forest in one solid cry and then it was silenced. In the moment though, in my near sleep state and with the sound of wind, I wasn't sure what it was, an animal or something, but I sat straight up in my sleeping bag and reached for my flashlight. Just silence though, just the wind, the sound of trees and the feeling of every hair on my neck standing on end. Took some time, but I eventually went back to sleep. At the time I reasoned it had to be something else. That morning Bradley was already up and had his coffee brewing over a newly made fire. After waking myself up a bit and starting my own breakfast, I asked him if he had heard anything last night. He asked what I had heard and I described it to him as I did just now. He said something like, "Oh yeah, I did hear that. It was loud, wasn't it? We talked about what sort of an animal could make a noise like that and neither of us could come up with anything." He even said, "To be honest, it sounded like a man screaming for his life." He asked if he could continue on with me, and at that moment I was glad to have someone with me for a while. Honest to God, he was such a nice guy and I swear I never felt unsafe around him. Sometime during the day we passed a group of hikers. 3 women and 2 men all carrying packs. They were heading in our direction but at a slower pace and asked us if we knew where a water source was. We both started at the same time to tell them, so I let Bradley finish. I've hiked this trail for as long as I could walk, and listening to his description of the trail ahead one would think that he had too. But I noticed early on Bradley had an impeccable memory and sense of direction. For the rest of the hike he asked a lot of questions about myself. By the time we reached a place to camp for the night, I felt like I had told him my entire life story. He seemed so honestly interested though. I felt like at the time that I was making a new best friend or something. That night was when I noticed for the first time the Bowie knife he had tucked on the side of his backpack. He pulled it out and expertly sliced an apple, nearly keeping everything but the seeds. I was kinda wondering where the apple came from, considering that last night he had told me that he was getting low on rations and that he intended to jump off the trail and hit a store before getting back on. But I didn't ask as he tossed me part of it. He talked a little about his family, specifically his younger brother who he said I reminded him of. He mentioned more than once that I would have got along with him. He's not backpacked in years though. John was his name, he had said. After John had went away, Bradley didn't have a partner to hike with and so he had been going at it solo for the past 4 years. I started to feel bad for the guy as I realized there was a part of him that was lonely, I think. I dunno. At this point I have no idea what to think. Shit, okay. I have to focus. So that night I couldn't sleep. I was just wide awake, thinking about how my trip was nearly over and that I hated the feeling of coming back to work and dealing with the real world. I had to pee, so I put on my shirt, boots and tried to unzip my tent so as not to wake up Bradley. This was last night, and it was cold too. Standing in the woods, I could hear just barely over the wind the sound of talking. Must be the group that we passed before. Most hikers like that don't ever think that there might be others around them. Or animals looking in, and so they talk and laugh as if they are the only ones in the world. I started to make my way toward the sound out of curiosity, I guess. I dunno what I was thinking. I could see their firelight jumping around between the pines, and one of the women burst out laughing. Before I got any closer, their voices dropped in volume. I was about 25 feet away with trees between us. The sound of that first scream still saturates my mind. Shit, I don't know what to do. I am going to have to stop typing for a moment. Okay, so it was nothing like anything I had ever felt or experienced before. Those people were dying. I know that now. I saw it on the news when I got home. I couldn't see anything, so I don't know what happened. I mean, I know what happened. I know it because of what the reports have said. But fuck, I don't really know. I don't. It was as if I were trapped inside of a tornado of screams and darkness. Somehow I was on the ground, not sure if I fell down or what. Pine needles on my hands. I was trying to get back to my tent. That's all I wanted. I've never felt such fear. Yes, that's what it was. It was fear. It was complete terror. I could hear one of the men call out a name. A woman's name, but right now I can't think of what it was. I just know he sounded absolutely horrified. Then I heard him screaming. Begging and screaming. Crying and screaming. I ran. I was able to run finally. By the time I made it back to my camp and into my tent, the air was silent. Something had killed those people. But I knew it wasn't a something. It was a someone. I knew it and I know it. It felt like I was drunk. I couldn't think clearly. I was disoriented. I kept hearing things that maybe weren't anything at all. I sat in my tent frozen. That's what terror feels like. That's what it is. I am not sure how much time passed, but my heart stopped when I heard Bradley's tent unzip. I heard the sound of him taking off his boots, and then after his tent was zipped again. I could tell he was sliding into his sleeping bag. I didn't sleep. I sat there till the sun came up. That was this morning. We made a fire, had our breakfast. He chatted a little about spring mornings and other things. I don't know how I held it together. I don't. He asked if I wouldn't mind dropping him off at a store near the trail exit I was about to hit where my car waited. Which I did. This morning about 11 a.m. we pulled up to Breaker's Market just off the @ He thanked me and asked if he could have my number in case he ever needed a partner for a hike. I gave it to him. After our conversations the days before, he already knows where I live and work. He shook my hand and patted me on the shoulder. I jumped in my car and got home this afternoon. I think I slept for about an hour maybe. The local news just reported people missing on the trail where I was. Also, I just heard that 5 people have been confirmed dead in what appears to be an animal attack. What do I do? I know why those people are missing. They're all dead. Most likely gutted and butchered, screaming to be allowed to live. God knows how many more are laying out there in parts right now. Their killer is still out there too, and I gave him my phone number.